Hello everyone, and welcome back to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to fall asleep, and I'm here to deliver. But before starting, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. This happened years ago, back when I was still in high school. My friends and I were a tight-knit group. We did everything together, from homework to weekend trips, and we shared a love for the outdoors. I was always the one suggesting adventures, and my friends, being the carefree souls they were, never hesitated to follow along. But there was one trip, one adventure, that changed everything for us, and it started with something as simple as a weekend camping trip. We lived in a small town, nestled between thick, dense forests and sprawling hills. People often said there was something eerie about those woods, but most of us never paid much attention. It was just a forest, right? A place where people went to hike, camp, and enjoy the peace of nature. But there was always a story or two about strange happenings out there. Locals had a way of making every place seem more mysterious than it actually was. On one particularly warm Saturday afternoon, my friends and I decided we were going to take a trip into the forest. We had been talking about it for a while, and the moment the weekend rolled around, we packed our bags and headed for the woods. I'll never forget that feeling of excitement, the anticipation of getting away from the usual weekend routines. It was all going to be just another camping trip, just another weekend getaway. We had 4 of us, me, Lucas, and 2 of my closest friends, Charlie and Ben. All of us had been camping before, but never in that part of the forest. It was an area where few people ventured, mainly because of the old rumors about strange noises and unsettling sightings. But to us, those were just stories to laugh about around a campfire. We weren't about to let some creepy tales scare us away. Our plan was simple. We would hike in, set up camp, spend the night, and head back the next day. It was nothing we hadn't done countless times before. We left early in the morning, laughing and joking about the things we'd do when we got there. We had no idea what was waiting for us. As we ventured deeper into the forest, the trees grew thicker, casting shadows that stretched across the path. The air became heavier, like it was filled with something we couldn't quite name. But it wasn't unpleasant, just different. It wasn't long before we realized that the deeper we went, the quieter it became. The usual sounds of birds and insects were missing, and all we could hear was the crunch of our footsteps on the forest floor. I remember looking around, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that was slowly creeping up on me. The forest was beautiful, no doubt, but there was something strange about the silence. It wasn't the kind of peace you'd expect. It was an oppressive silence, like the forest itself was holding its breath. We eventually found a spot near a stream, perfect for setting up camp. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting an orange glow over everything. The air was starting to chill, and we knew we had to get the fire going soon. We set up our tents and gathered wood for the fire, joking about how we always ended up doing the hard work while Ben made dinner. The evening passed like any other camping trip. We ate, laughed, and told stories under the stars. It was all so normal. We didn't know it then, but we were about to step into something we couldn't possibly understand, a place where the boundary between the real world and something far darker would start to blur. As night fell, the woods around us seemed to shift. The shadows grew longer, and the temperature dropped sharply. It was then that we first heard a noise. At first, it was faint, so faint that we almost dismissed it as the wind. But then it came again. A soft, almost imperceptible rustling, like something or someone was moving through the trees just beyond our camp. We looked at each other, silent for a moment. Was it an animal? A person? Or something else? None of us said it out loud, but we all had the same thought. We're not alone here. None of us wanted to admit it, but the unsettling feeling was growing. The rustling continued, but it wasn't like any animal we'd heard before. It was rhythmic, deliberate, almost like it was circling us. But the more we listened, the more we realized it didn't sound like it was coming from one direction. It was all around us, echoing through the trees. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the wind or some wild animal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It was too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your heart race. We sat around the fire, trying to ignore the growing unease that was wrapping around us like a thick fog. We told ourselves it was nothing. That night, we went to bed, leaving the fire burning low in the center of the camp. I crawled into my sleeping bag, still trying to dismiss the feeling that had settled in my chest. But as I lay there, staring at the canvas of the tent above me, I could hear it again, the rustling. But this time, it was closer, much closer. It was at that moment, in the dead of night, that I realized the forest wasn't as quiet as I had thought. Something was out there. Something was waiting. The night stretched on in a tense silence, broken only by the occasional crackle from the dying fire. It was as if the forest had settled into a deep, unsettling stillness, almost too quiet. My friends and I lay in our tents, trying to sleep, though none of us could shake the lingering discomfort. I stared at the fabric above me, the cold creeping into my bones, despite the warmth of my sleeping bag. Then, it happened. A soft thud. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks. But then, another thud followed by a faint rustle, much like the sound of leaves being disturbed. I held my breath, listening closely. The noise wasn't coming from any of us. It wasn't one of my friends shifting in their sleep or the wind moving through the trees. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic. I reached out of my sleeping bag and gently unzipped the tent. The cold night air hit me, sending a chill through my body as I peered out into the darkness. Nothing. The trees stood still, their branches casting twisted shadows across the forest floor. But the noise, it was still there. It was faint but unmistakable. A soft, methodical thumping, like someone or something was walking slowly through the woods. Each step was punctuated by a brief pause, as though the thing was waiting for something. My heart began to race, but I kept my eyes locked on the forest, trying to make sense of it. I glanced back at the tents. Charlie and Ben were still inside their tents, their silhouettes barely visible in the dim light of the fire. I couldn't tell if they had heard anything. Maybe it was just me. Maybe I was imagining things. But then, there it was again. Another thud, followed by the faint rustling of leaves. I felt a sudden, sharp sense of urgency. I had to know what it was. I slipped out of the tent quietly, not wanting to wake the others just yet. My bare feet sank into the cool, damp ground as I crept toward the source of the sound. My eyes darted around the darkened forest, trying to make out any movement, any shape that could explain the noise. For a moment, everything seemed still. But then, I saw it. A figure. Not a person, but a shadow. A shape moving between the trees, slowly and methodically, like it was searching for something. It was too far to make out any details, but the way it moved was unnerving. No sound of footsteps, no rustle of leaves like you'd expect from a person or animal moving through the forest. Just silence. My breath caught in my throat. I felt an icy chill run down my spine, and I instinctively took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure, frozen in place as it continued its slow, deliberate movement. And then it stopped. I could feel my body tense, my mind racing. What was it? Was it a person? Some kind of animal? Or something else entirely? The figure stood motionless for what felt like an eternity, and just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. One moment it was there, and the next, it was gone. I stood there, staring into the darkness, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. My breath was shallow, and I felt a wave of panic rising in my chest. But I couldn't bring myself to move, to leave the spot where I stood. It felt like the forest had somehow swallowed up the figure, like it never existed at all. After what seemed like hours, I finally forced myself to turn around and hurry back to the camp. I crawled back into my tent, my hands trembling as I zipped it up behind me. I lay there, wide-eyed, staring at the fabric of the tent, unable to sleep. The noise had stopped, but the unsettling feeling hadn't gone away. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, just an animal or maybe a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was something out there. Something watching us. When morning finally came, I didn't waste any time. I wasn't sure what I had seen or heard during the night, but I couldn't shake the sense of dread that lingered in my mind. I wasn't the only one who felt it either. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I heard Ben stirring his tent. A few moments later, Charlie spoke up. "Did anyone else hear that last night?" His voice was quiet, almost hesitant. It sounded like something was moving out there. I froze. I had no idea how to answer. Was I supposed to admit what I had seen? I didn't even know what it was. "You heard it too?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Charlie nodded, his face pale in the dim light. "Yeah, it wasn't like any animal I've ever heard. It was too deliberate, like it was pacing or something. I couldn't deny it. That was exactly how I had felt. The way the figure had moved, so slow and calculated. "We should go check it out," Ben suggested, "just to see if there's any sign of what it was." None of us said anything for a long moment. The thought of venturing back into the forest after what had happened was terrifying, but I knew we couldn't ignore it. Whatever it wasn't natural. "Let's pack up and head out," I said, trying to sound confident. "Well, go find out what's really going on here." We gathered our things in uneasy silence, the weight of the night's events pressing on all of us. None of us knew exactly what to expect as we made our way back into the forest, but it was clear that the peaceful trip we had hoped for was long gone. We weren't just hiking through the woods anymore. We were walking into something far darker than we had ever imagined. As we made our way deeper into the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig had me on edge. But no matter how hard I searched, there was nothing. No sign of the figure, no trace of what had been moving through the woods. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was out there, somewhere in the shadows, waiting. And I knew that if we didn't find answers soon, whatever was stalking us in that forest would make itself known in ways we couldn't even begin to understand. As the days wore on, the uneasy feeling we all shared continued to grow, like an invisible weight pressing down on our chests. Every little noise, every subtle shift in the trees made our hearts race. It was as if the forest itself was conspiring against us, the air heavy with something unspoken, something lurking just out of reach. We tried to push through the tension, to carry on with the trip, but it became increasingly difficult to ignore the strange occurrences. What had started as a mere curiosity had now become a constant presence, one that gnawed at us, making each step forward feel more like a step deeper into the unknown. One morning, as I was packing up my things, I noticed something peculiar. A small object, a twig or branch, lay just outside my tent. But it wasn't there when I had gone to sleep. It was too deliberate, too perfectly placed, to be just a random piece of debris. I crouched down to examine it, but before I could reach out, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I spun around quickly, heart pounding, but the clearing was empty. No one had come close. I could feel my pulse thudding in my ears as I stood there, staring into the empty woods. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me from the shadows. When I returned to the campsite, Charlie and Ben were already there, packing their gear. But neither of them seemed to notice the growing tension, or at least they didn't acknowledge it. Their usual banter was absent, replaced by a stiff silence that only added to the oppressive atmosphere. It felt like we were all just going through the motions, trying to act normal, while the forest around us seemed to grow increasingly hostile. It was later that afternoon when things began to escalate. We had made our way deeper into the woods, the path narrowing as we moved away from the open clearing. The trees here were thicker, their branches intertwining above us, casting long, dark shadows that seemed to swallow up the sunlight. I kept my eyes peeled, aware of the eerie silence that had settled over everything. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the oppressive quiet that hung in the air. As we walked, I noticed something else. The trails seemed to be changing. The ground was uneven, as if the earth itself had shifted. We had passed this way before, but now everything felt wrong. The trees were closer together, the path more winding. It was as though the forest had changed overnight, reshaped itself in a way that was impossible to explain. "Does this path look different to you guys?" I asked, glancing at Charlie and Ben. They both looked around, and I could see the uncertainty in their eyes. Ben frowned, then shrugged. "I don't know. I don't remember it looking like this," he said. Charlie squinted into the dense forest ahead. "Yeah, something's off. But it's probably just the fog or something. I don't know." But I didn't buy it. The sense of being lost, of being trapped in this shifting labyrinth, was growing stronger with every step we took. We continued walking, but the unease grew with each passing minute. The air felt thick, heavier than it should have been. I could hear my breath coming in shallow bursts, my feet dragging in the dirt. My mind kept replaying the noises from the night before, the soft thuds, the rustling leaves, the figure in the shadows, and I couldn't shake the image of that shape moving through the trees, just out of reach. It wasn't something I could explain, but I knew that it was still out there, watching. That's when the first real sign of something unnatural hit us. A scream! It came from somewhere far off in the distance, but it wasn't the kind of scream you'd expect from a human. It was shrill, sharp, almost inhuman, like an animal in pain. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze in my tracks. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Charlie and Ben nodded, their faces pale. We all stood there in stunned silence, straining to hear. But the scream came again, closer this time, and louder. It was followed by an eerie, bone-chilling silence that seemed to stretch on forever. "I don't know what that was," Ben said, his voice shaky. "But I don't want to stick around to find out." Without saying another word, we all turned and started walking faster, heading back toward the camp. But the forest seemed to close in around us, the trees crowding closer, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes. It felt as though the woods themselves were closing in, trapping us within their dark embrace. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone anymore. There was something following us, something that had been watching us from the moment we set foot in this cursed place. We moved quickly, our footsteps hurried and erratic, but no matter how fast we walked, the air felt colder, the shadows deeper. The trees seemed to grow taller, their branches reaching down like long, bony fingers. I could feel the presence of something out there, just beyond the edges of my vision. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to run, to get out of the forest before whatever it was had a chance to catch up to us. But then, as if the forest itself was toying with us, the path split. We stopped dead in our tracks, staring at the two different trails ahead. One was dark and narrow, winding deeper into the woods, while the other was broader, but the trees loomed overhead like sentinels, casting everything in a thick, unnatural shadow. It didn't make any sense. The path had been a straight line when we first came through, but now it had split. "What the hell?" Charlie muttered, looking at the fork. "This is not the way we came," Ben said, shaking his head. "This is wrong." I felt my stomach drop. None of this made sense. The forest had changed, reshaped itself in ways I couldn't explain. I looked at the two paths, each one dark and foreboding in its own way. Neither felt safe, but there was no way around it. We had to make a decision. I stepped forward, but before I could speak, a sound rang through the air, a deep, guttural growl that seemed to come from all around us, echoing through the trees. It wasn't an animal, not like anything we had ever heard. It was something primal, something ancient, like the forest itself was alive and angry. That's when I knew We weren't just lost in the woods anymore. We were being hunted, and the forest wasn't going to let us leave without a fight. The air was thick with tension, each of us frozen in place, too terrified to make a sound. We stood at the fork in the path, heartbeats drumming in our ears, the forest around us utterly still. The growl, that terrible, primal noise, reverberated through the trees like a warning. It wasn't an animal, I knew that now. It was something much worse. Something older, something that had been waiting for us in the shadows. Charlie was the first to move. He took a shaky step backward, his eyes wide with fear. We need to get out of here. Now. But before he could turn to run, the growl came again, louder this time. It echoed through the trees, vibrating in the very ground beneath our feet. I could feel it in my chest, the deep, resonant growl that seemed to shake the air itself. The forest was alive with it, each tree and branch reverberating as though they too were alive, caught in the grip of something ancient and powerful. I glanced to my left, then to my right. The path stretched ahead in both directions, but no matter which way we looked, it felt like the forest was closing in. It was like we had been transported into some other world where the laws of nature no longer applied. We were caught in a nightmare, and there was no way out. Without a word, I turned and started running down the path to the left, my legs moving on their own as fear surged through me. Behind me, I could hear the others running too, but it didn't matter. We were all running, desperate to escape whatever was hunting us. We didn't know where we were going, didn't care where the path led. We just had to keep moving. The sound of our footsteps, pounding in the dirt, was drowned out by the eerie, unnatural silence of the forest. It was as if the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something. Every now and then, I could hear a rustling, a movement just beyond the trees, but when I looked, there was nothing there. It was as if the shadows themselves were alive, shifting and flickering, just out of reach. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, adrenaline pumping through my veins. The forest had become a maze, each turn leading us deeper into its dark heart. But the growl was never far behind, always just out of sight, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. We kept running, but the path seemed to twist and bend in impossible ways. The trees, thick and gnarled, stretched overhead, blocking out the sky. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. It was suffocating, and I could feel my breath coming in shallow gasps. We were lost, and I knew it. Suddenly, the ground beneath us shifted. The earth trembled, a deep, guttural rumble that made the air feel like it was charged with electricity. I stumbled, barely catching myself, and looked around in panic. The trees were swaying, their branches creaking like old bones. And then I saw it. A shadow! It was massive, a towering shape moving between the trees, its form too large to be any creature I had ever seen. It was a silhouette, impossibly tall, with limbs that stretched and bent in unnatural ways. Its eyes, if you could call them eyes, glowed in eerie yellow, like the eyes of a predator stalking its prey. And it was coming toward us. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I was paralyzed by fear, my legs frozen in place. The others were no better. Charlie and Ben were standing there, staring at the creature, their faces pale with terror. The creature stepped forward, its long limbs moving with terrifying speed. The sound of its steps, heavy and deliberate, shook the ground. It didn't make a sound as it moved, but the air seemed to ripple around it, distorting in its wake. "Run!" Ben shouted, his voice breaking with fear. And then we did. We ran as fast as we could, pushing ourselves beyond our limits. The creature followed, its movements swift and fluid, closing the distance between us with every step. I could feel it, feel its presence behind me, its eyes boring into my back like hot coals. The sound of its footsteps was deafening, louder than our own, a constant reminder that we weren't alone. That thing was right there, hunting us. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear it getting closer, its breath hot and labored in the air. It wasn't even trying to be stealthy anymore. It was coming for us, and it wasn't going to stop until it had what it wanted. We reached a clearing, and for a moment, I thought we might be able to make it. But as I looked around, my heart sank. The clearing was empty. There was no way out. The trees formed a solid wall around us, and the path behind us had disappeared. It was as though the forest itself had swallowed the way we came. The creature emerged from the shadows, its glowing eyes fixed on us. It stood there, towering over us, its face obscured by darkness. It was impossible to tell what it really looked like. Its form was constantly shifting, like a mirage, a creature made of darkness itself. But its presence was unmistakable. It was here to kill. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I looked around desperately, searching for a way out. But there was nothing, no escape. And then, just as I thought we were doomed, something strange happened. The creature stopped. It was as if something had frozen it in place, as if the very air had changed. The glow of its eyes dimmed, and its massive form seemed to waver, like a mirage flickering in and out of existence. It stood there, motionless, its presence still oppressive, but somehow less immediate, as if it were waiting for something. I dared a glance at Charlie and Ben. Their faces were a mirror of my own fear, wide-eyed and breathless. We were all in this together, but at that moment, it felt like we were the only 3 people left in the world. I took a hesitant step forward, and the creature didn't move. Another step, then another. And then, for reasons I can't explain, I started to walk toward it. My body was acting on its own, each step taken with no real thought, as if the fear had been replaced by something else. Something stronger. I reached out, my hand trembling, and for the first time, the creature's eyes met mine. It wasn't just a feeling anymore. I could see it. I could see the anger, the hunger in those eyes. And I could feel it deep in my soul, the raw, visceral need to survive, to get away, to escape whatever this thing was. But something was happening. It was like the creature was fading, its form flickering in and out of focus, as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling around it. And then, in an instant, it was gone. There was no sound, no movement. It just vanished. We stood there in stunned silence, too afraid to speak. The creature had been real, but now it was gone. Had it truly left? Or was it just waiting for the next opportunity? I didn't know. But in that moment, I knew one thing for sure. We were never going to be the same again. The clearing was still, too still. We stood there, not moving, not speaking, as if the very act of acknowledging the situation would make it real again. For a moment, time seemed to stretch, each second an eternity. The forest around us had returned to its eerie silence. No more growls, no more unnatural sounds, just the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. But my heart raced in my chest, a steady drumbeat of panic that wouldn't stop, no matter how much I tried to calm myself. I could feel the weight of the moment, the undeniable knowledge that we had come face to face with something that shouldn't exist. And now, there we were, left to pick up the pieces. Is it gone? Ben whispered, his voice barely audible, as if saying the words aloud would summon the creature back. He was shaking, his hand gripping the trunk of a tree like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. Charlie, who had been standing just behind me, took a slow step forward. His eyes darted around the clearing, scanning for any sign of the creature. I don't know. He stopped, his breath catching. It can't be gone. It can't just disappear. We all exchanged looks. None of us had the answers, and I could feel the weight of our collective uncertainty settling in. Had the creature truly left, or was it simply waiting? Was it lurking, hidden somewhere in the trees, watching us? Or had we just witnessed the final trick of something far older and more terrifying than we could ever comprehend? I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to work, though it felt like a struggle. We need to leave, I said, more to myself than to the others. The words tasted bitter in my mouth, but they were the only ones that made sense. The longer we stayed here, the more vulnerable we became. We had to get out, to return to some semblance of normal life, even if we would never fully escape the horrors we had encountered. But how? Where was the path? The one we had come down was gone, swallowed by the forest, as if it had never existed at all. The trees loomed around us like silent sentinels, their twisted branches blocking any view of the sky above. I couldn't even remember which direction we had come from, and it was a sinking feeling I had never experienced before, the realization that we were lost in the very woods we had thought we knew. "We can't just stand here," Charlie said, his voice rising in urgency. "We need to find the way out." But as soon as the words left his mouth, a sickening realization hit me. The forest was no longer just a backdrop. It was part of the terror we had faced. It wasn't just the creature we had to escape from. It was the forest itself. The way it seemed to bend and twist, its paths shifting and changing, trapping us in a nightmare we couldn't wake from. "We'll figure it out," I said, my voice coming out more confident than I felt. "Let's stay calm. Let's look for any signs of a trail." We began to walk, slowly at first, as we searched for some clue, some hint of where we might be. Every step felt like we were walking deeper into the abyss. The shadows in the trees seemed to shift, moving just out of the corner of my eye, as if the forest was alive, watching, waiting for something. The minutes dragged on, and then the hours. We moved carefully, retracing our steps as best as we could, but with no trail to follow, we could only guess. Every rustle in the bushes, every crack of a twig, sent us into a frenzy of fear. At one point, I swore I heard a branch snap just beyond the trees, but when I turned, there was nothing there. Nothing but the oppressive stillness. "Should we split up?" Ben asked, his voice strained. "Maybe we can cover more ground." I shook my head immediately. The thought of separating, even for a moment, felt like the worst possible idea. It would be just like before, when we had wandered off the path and into the nightmare. I couldn't risk it. Not again. "No," I said firmly. "We stay together. We'll find a way out. We just need to keep moving." As we continued through the dense woods, the eerie silence began to get to us. The forest, which had once been familiar, now felt foreign, hostile even. Every crackle of a branch, every gust of wind felt like it carried the weight of something watching us from the shadows. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, we stumbled across something. It wasn't much, a small break in the trees, a patch of open ground where the underbrush had cleared away. It looked like it might be an old campsite, or at least an area where someone had recently passed through. There were no signs of life, no human presence, but the clearing felt different. It felt safer. I turned to the others, my breath catching in my chest. "Do you think we're getting closer?" Charlie stepped forward, his eyes scanning the area. "Maybe, but we shouldn't stop. We need to keep moving." But just as he said it, I caught a glimpse of something in the distance, through the trees. A shadow, a flicker of movement too quick to fully register. I froze, my blood running cold. The creature, it was back. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt the urge to run again, but I held myself in place. We couldn't run forever. We had to face whatever this was, whatever had been stalking us through the woods. "Do you see it?" Ben asked, his voice shaky as he looked in the same direction. "I think so," I said, my voice tight with fear. We began to move toward the shadow, slowly, cautiously, but with no real plan. As we got closer, the shape took form, and what we saw made my stomach churn. It wasn't the creature. Not exactly. It was something else. A figure, human-shaped, standing in the distance, cloaked in darkness. My legs went weak. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. "Who is that?" Charlie whispered. But there was no answer. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching us. And then, without warning, it vanished. Gone in an instant. We were alone again. There was no sound, no movement, just the silence of the forest closing in around us. I looked at Charlie and Ben, their faces pale with shock and confusion. What had we just witnessed? Was it part of the same nightmare? Or was it something new, something worse? We didn't have time to figure it out. We turned and ran, heading toward what we hoped was the edge of the woods. With every step, the tension in my chest grew. I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was pulling us back in, that it didn't want us to leave. And yet, as we pushed forward, the light began to change. It was faint at first, just the slightest difference in the way the trees stood, the way the shadows fell. The path, our path, finally began to open up. The trees thinned, the underbrush cleared, and suddenly we were at the edge of the forest. The sun was low in the sky, casting a pale light across the land. The woods were behind us, and we had escaped. But as I looked back, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake. And I couldn't help but wonder, was it truly over? Had we escaped, or had the forest simply let us go? I didn't have the answers, and I wasn't sure I ever would. We finally made it back to the edge of the forest, breathless and terrified. The sun had dipped low, casting long shadows over the land. The sky had taken on a dim, twilight way, and the once familiar woods now felt like something entirely alien, an impenetrable wall that had swallowed us whole. It had taken everything to get out. Every ounce of our strength, every ounce of courage, and still I felt as if the forest was still pressing in on me. Even now, standing at the clearing's edge, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. We hadn't spoken much since we broke free from the woods. The silence was too heavy, the weight of what had just happened too much to process. But as I looked over at Ben and Charlie, I could see it in their eyes. They were just as shaken as I was. We all carried the same fear, the same unspoken question that hovered between us. What had we really encountered out there? It wasn't just the creature. No, it was something more insidious, something older. It was the way the forest had moved around us, shifting paths, hiding things, manipulating reality until we were left with no sense of what was real. It felt like the land itself had a will, a consciousness. And for the briefest of moments, it felt like we were nothing more than pawns in a game we couldn't understand. I took a deep breath, trying to ground myself, but it didn't help. The images of those eyes, the whispers of movement just beyond my reach, still clung to my mind like a thick fog. How could we just walk away from all of it? How could we return to the normalcy of our lives when the shadows of the forest would forever haunt our memories? We didn't talk much after that. We didn't need to. There was nothing left to say. We all went our separate ways, back to the world we had once known. I tried to return to my routine, to my normal life, but it never felt the same. Every rustling of leaves, every creaking of wood sent me into a panic. The fear wasn't gone. It was always there, lingering just beneath the surface, waiting to resurface when I least expected it. And then there was the question of what to tell people. We couldn't tell anyone what had happened. No one would believe us. Even if we tried to explain it, the words wouldn't capture the fear, the terror that had gripped us. The forest wasn't something that could be understood with mere words. It was something that could only be felt, and I wasn't sure I could put it into a form that would make sense to anyone else. But the strangest part of all, what I still can't shake, is the feeling that we were never supposed to leave. The forest had shown us something powerful and ancient, and we had survived it. But surviving it didn't mean it was over. It was as though the forest had marked us in some way, as if it was always watching, waiting for the right moment to pull us back into its depths. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I still hear those sounds, rustling branches, footsteps that aren't mine, whispers that seem to come from far away. I can't explain it, but I feel like the forest hasn't finished with me yet. Like we haven't seen the last of whatever we encountered out there. It's a feeling I can't shake, one that I can't ignore. I haven't returned to those woods. I don't think I ever will. But the truth is, I'm not sure that I need to. The forest has a way of staying with you. It's in the back of my mind, in the corners of my thoughts. The forest isn't something you can forget. It doesn't let you. And maybe that's the scariest part of all, that we may never truly escape. It's always there, lingering in the darkness, just beyond the edge of what we can understand. And one day, it may just call us back. For now, I can only hope that the shadows stay where they belong, in the woods, where they can't reach me. But deep down, I wonder, will it ever truly be over? The silence settles in once again, and am left with the unshakable feeling that I've been marked, as if the forest has carved its memory into my soul. I wonder if the others feel it too, the pull of that place, the weight of what we've seen. For now, I'm safe. But how long can any of us stay safe when we've seen the depths of something so ancient and so terrifying? I can't say, but I'll never forget what happened. And maybe that's the point. The forest doesn't want you to forget, and it never lets you leave. This is a story I've been hesitant to tell, mainly because it's one of those experiences that still haunts me to this day. It happened a few years ago, back when I was working the night shift as an orderly in a nearly abandoned hospital. The kind of place you wouldn't even consider going to unless you absolutely had to. The hospital was built in the early 1900s and had seen better days. Most of the equipment was outdated, the halls were eerily quiet, and the staff was limited. It wasn't so much that it was underfunded, it was simply that the place had seen its time and was slowly being phased out. I was just passing through, doing my shift, trying to make ends meet. The building itself was massive. It had long, shadow-filled hallways that stretched on, and rooms filled with a haunting sense of abandonment. Every now and then, it'd catch a glimpse of an old portrait hanging crookedly on the wall, a faded black and white photo of someone who had long since passed. The walls were cracked, the paint peeling, and the floors creaked with every step you took. There were only a few patients left, all of whom were elderly and in the final stages of life. But the hospital still had a staff, just enough to keep the place functioning, but no more. I wasn't alone during my shifts. There were a couple of nurses, a few maintenance workers, and the doctors who came and went. But as the hours wore on, I started to notice something strange about the atmosphere in the hospital. At night, when the lights flickered and the hum of the machines became distant, there was a coldness to the air. It wasn't a physical cold, but something deeper. It's the kind of feeling you get when you realize that something just isn't right. It was during one of these shifts that I met a fellow orderly, a man named Samuel. He had been working at the hospital for years, but there was something unsettling about him. He was always friendly, always helpful, but there was something in his eyes, a kind of distance that made me question whether he had seen things I couldn't even begin to understand. Samuel was one of those people who didn't speak much about his life outside of work, but he knew the building like the back of his hand. At first, it was just another night, empty, quiet, and uneventful. I was doing my rounds, checking rooms, making sure everything was in order. The usual routine. But as I walked through the hallways, something felt off. Samuel had been working the same shift as me, but when I went to find him in the break room, he wasn't there. I thought maybe he had gone to check on something, or maybe he had taken a quick walk around. But as I turned down the hall to head to the far wing of the building, I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. There, at the end of the hallway, was Samuel. But it wasn't him in the way I remembered. The man standing there was stiff, unnervingly still, and his face was pale, almost too pale. His eyes were wide open, fixed on something ahead, and his mouth was slightly agape. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. I took a cautious step forward, and that's when I realized something. The lights above me flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the dimness. I called out again, louder this time, but he still didn't move. That's when the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The whole hospital had this feeling, like I wasn't supposed to be there, like I was intruding on something I had no business knowing about. But Samuel, he didn't seem like he was aware of my presence. And that was the first time I truly felt it, the cold presence that hung in the air of that hospital. I turned around to go find a nurse or someone else, but when I looked back, Samuel had disappeared. I checked all the rooms down that hallway and even went to the back areas of the building. Nothing. It was as if he had never been there. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, as if something was following me through the darkened halls. I kept hearing strange noises, whispers, or maybe it was the sound of someone moving, but when it'd turn around, there would be no one there. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I couldn't get that image of Samuel out of my mind. It was almost as if he had been there, but then he wasn't. And that's when I began to wonder, was it just my mind playing tricks on me? Or had I experienced something much darker, something that no one in their right mind would want to acknowledge? Little did I know, this was only the beginning. The next few shifts after that strange encounter with Samuel were unsettling, to say the least. But the more I thought about it, the more I convinced myself that I had just let my imagination get the best of me. The hospital had that kind of effect on people. The old building creaked, groaned, and hummed at night, its age and wear clearly taking their toll. Still, something about that night lingered with me, a feeling that I couldn't quite shake. I didn't speak to Samuel the next time I saw him. I wasn't sure how to approach him after what had happened, but I could tell he was acting differently too. He seemed more withdrawn, quieter than usual. I caught him staring at the walls more often, almost as if he was lost in thought, or maybe trying to avoid something. But I pushed it all aside, attributing his odd behavior to stress or exhaustion. It wasn't like I had any right to judge. It was around midnight when the first truly unsettling thing happened. I was making my rounds, checking in on the few patients still remaining in the hospital, when I heard a door creak open behind me. I hadn't noticed anyone following me down the hallway, and yet, when I turned around, I found the door to one of the rooms ajar. A low, eerie sound came from inside, like a faint, muffled cry. It was odd. None of the patients had shown signs of distress, and the rooms had all been locked securely. I approached the door cautiously. The hospital was quiet at this hour, so any sound felt amplified. My heart beat louder in my chest as I reached out to push the door open, the cold metal handle sending a shiver up my arm. As soon as I stepped inside, everything seemed to freeze. The room was empty, except for a chair in the far corner. But it wasn't just any chair. It was positioned facing the wall, and I could see the faintest outline of something, or someone, sitting in it. I squinted in the dim light, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But there was nothing, just an empty, slightly crooked chair. There was no one there. I took a few more cautious steps into the room and checked every corner. The bed was made, the window was closed, and everything seemed to be in its place. But that feeling, the same feeling I had when I saw Samuel in the hallway, was back. I was being watched, but there was no one to be seen. I left the room quickly, my breath shallow as I retraced my steps down the hallway. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a rational explanation. Could it have been a draft? A trick of the light? Maybe the chair had just been left in an odd position by a nurse earlier. But no matter how I tried to reason with myself, I couldn't shake the unease that clung to me like a heavy fog. The next few nights were a blur of routine. The odd occurrences seemed to settle down a bit, and I began to convince myself that it was just the stress of the job getting to me. It wasn't until one particularly quiet evening when I began to realize I wasn't imagining things. I was on the same floor, the same wing where I had heard the strange sounds before. As I walked past the long corridor leading to the nurse's station, I noticed that a few of the lights were flickering. At first, I thought it was nothing more than a malfunction, but as I got closer, I noticed something even stranger. The air felt colder than it should have been, almost icy, despite the heat outside. I heard something, a shuffle of footsteps, like someone walking just out of sight. I stopped, straining my ears, and waited for a moment. The hospital was so quiet, the silence stretching on for what felt like an eternity. Then, the footsteps came again, only this time they were closer, as though someone was right behind me. I turned around, but there was no one there. My pulse quickened as I tried to convince myself that it was just the old building settling, the sound of pipes or vents playing tricks on my ears. But as I turned to continue my walk, I noticed something else. On the floor in front of me, a small puddle of water. It wasn't there before, I was sure of it. I bent down to examine it, my breath catching in my throat. The water was cold, almost freezing to the touch, and it didn't have any clear origin. No broken pipes, no leaks in sight. It was just there, as though it had appeared out of nowhere. I took a step back, uneasy now. Was the hospital just falling apart, or was something else going on? The question lingered in my mind as I continued my rounds, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn deeper into something that I couldn't understand. Later that night, I spoke briefly with the head nurse, a woman named Catherine. She had been working at the hospital for longer than anyone else, and she seemed to know everything about the building's history. I mentioned the strange occurrences, the flickering lights, the cold spots, and the odd puddle of water, and Catherine just gave me a knowing look. "You're not the first one to notice," she said, her voice low. "This hospital has a long history. People have seen things here, things that don't make sense." At first, I thought she was just trying to brush it off, to downplay my concerns. But there was a strange look in her eyes, something between sadness and resignation. She didn't elaborate, and I didn't press her. But I knew, deep down, that there was more to this place than anyone was willing to admit. The following night, I had another encounter, one that I still can't fully explain. As I walked down the same hallway again, I noticed a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned, half expecting to see a nurse or another staff member, but no one was there. The hallway was empty, save for the occasional flicker of light. But then, I heard it, the soft sound of something scraping along the floor. I looked down, my heart pounding in my chest. A small object, a paperclip, perhaps, or something equally insignificant, was sliding slowly across the floor, as though pushed by an invisible hand. I bent down, my hand reaching out instinctively, but before I could touch it, the object stopped, as though frozen in place. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. But nothing made sense anymore. The sense of unease, the feeling of being watched, had grown too strong to ignore. And yet, there was no one there to confirm it. No one but me, alone in the dark halls of a hospital that was slowly revealing its secrets. By the time I finished my shift that night, I was exhausted, not just physically, but mentally. It was becoming harder to tell what was real and what was just my mind playing tricks. But one thing was certain. Something was happening in that hospital, something I couldn't explain. And I had the sinking feeling that I had only scratched the surface. The next day, I did my best to put it all out of my mind. But I couldn't ignore the feeling that I was on the brink of discovering something far more sinister than I could ever imagine. As the days passed, the unsettling events in the hospital began to increase in frequency. What started as a strange occurrence here and there soon became a regular part of my night shifts. I began to feel like I was losing my grip on reality, as though I was living in a constant state of unease. I wasn't the only one. The other staff members started to notice things too. It was subtle at first, a flickering light in the corner of a hallway, the faint scent of something old and musty in certain rooms, but soon it grew more difficult to ignore. It was late one evening when I first heard the whispers again. They weren't the soft, faint sounds of someone just out of reach, like I had experienced before. No, these were clear, distinct murmurs that seemed to come from all around me. I was walking down the hallway near the psychiatric ward, a part of the hospital that had been mostly abandoned for years. The lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. The air felt thick and stale, like it had been locked in for decades, and I had to fight the urge to hold my breath as I made my way past the rooms. The whispers began as a murmur, like the rustling of paper, but they grew louder, more distinct, until I could swear I heard someone, no, something, murmuring my name. My skin crawled as I stood frozen in place, listening. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as the sound came closer, but there was no one in sight. The hallway was as empty as it had been before. It was then that I noticed something else. A door at the end of the hall, one that I had passed by countless times, was slowly creaking open. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at the darkened doorway. I hadn't seen anyone near it just moments before. I knew that room hadn't been used in years. In fact, I was certain it had been sealed shut to prevent anyone from entering. Yet there it was, wide open, the darkness beyond it threatening to pull me in. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing, my body frozen in place. But then, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. My pulse quickened as I rushed past, my feet pounding against the cold tile floor. But when I reached the end of the hall, the door was closed tight, as though nothing had happened. I didn't know what to think. My mind was reeling with 1,000 questions. Was I losing my mind? Was the hospital just playing tricks on me? Or was there something more sinister going on, something I couldn't understand? That night, I confided in Catherine again, though I wasn't sure what I was hoping for. I wasn't sure if I was looking for answers or just someone to tell me I wasn't going crazy. The whispers, the door, I said, my voice trembling slightly. It's happening again. I can't explain it. Catherine didn't seem surprised. She just looked at me with those same tired eyes, her expression unreadable. I told you before, she said softly, her voice tinged with a deep sadness. This place isn't normal. There's more to it than just old walls and creaky floors. Something's been here for a long time, and it's not planning on leaving. I didn't know what to say to that. Her words hung in the air, thick and heavy. For the first time, I felt the weight of the building pressing down on me. It was as if the hospital itself had become a living, breathing thing, watching, waiting. Over the next few days, things only got worse. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. I could hear them no matter where I went, whether I was in the supply room, the hallway, or even the staff break room. They seemed to follow me, echoing in my ears like a soft chant. I began to lose track of time, my exhaustion mounting as I found myself wandering the hallways in a daze, unsure of where I was going. It was during one of these aimless walks that I stumbled upon a part of the hospital I hadn't seen before. It was an old storage room, hidden away behind a rusty, creaking door at the back of a maintenance closet. I had never noticed it before, and I certainly had no idea why it was locked away like that. Curiosity got the best of me, and I pushed the door open, my breath catching in my throat as the hinges screamed in protest. The room was pitch dark, the air thick with dust and the smell of mold. As I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. I spun around, panic rising in my chest, but there was no escape. The room was small, barely enough space to move, and yet there was something strange about it. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I could make out the shapes of old furniture piled up in the corners, broken chairs, abandoned carts, and what looked like rusted medical equipment. But it was the far corner of the room that caught my attention. There, in the dim light, was a large, covered object. It looked like a bed, but it was draped in what appeared to be a thick, black cloth. I couldn't see what was underneath, but I could feel its presence, as though someone, was waiting inside. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest. The room felt colder now, the air heavy and suffocating. With every step, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, until I could almost make out words. They were saying something to me, something I couldn't quite understand, but it felt like a warning. I reached out, my hand trembling as I grabbed the edge of the cloth and pulled it away. My breath caught in my throat as I looked at what lay beneath. It wasn't a bed at all, it was a hospital gurney, one that had clearly been used many years ago. The once white sheets were stained and torn, and the metal frame was rusted and broken. But it was the body that lay on the gurney that took my breath away. It was nothing more than a decayed, mummified corpse, unrecognizable, its flesh withered and shrunken. The face was a twisted, grotesque mask, its eyes hollow and empty. The figure was dressed in an old hospital gown, its hands curled into tight skeletal fists. And around its neck was a thick, black rope, as if the body had been strangled and left to rot in this forgotten room. I staggered back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers were deafening now, ringing in my ears as I turned and ran from the room. The door wouldn't open at first, and I slammed against it in desperation, but finally it gave way. I stumbled into the hallway, the dark figures of the hospital pressing in around me like they were alive. The air was thick with the stench of death and decay, and I couldn't shake the image of that face, the face of someone who had died here, in this very hospital, and had never been allowed to rest. I knew then that I couldn't ignore it any longer. There was something in this building, something that didn't belong, and I was going to find out what it was, whether I was ready or not. The hospital's secrets were starting to come to light, but they were far darker than I could have ever imagined. And as I would soon find out, those whispers were just the beginning of something far more horrifying. The atmosphere within the hospital had shifted dramatically. It was no longer just a place of illness, care, and routine. It was a place of dread, where the air felt thick with tension, and the walls seemed to whisper their secrets. I couldn't ignore it any longer, the feeling that something was deeply wrong. It was a cold, rainy night when everything came to a head. The hospital, quiet as it always was after hours, seemed darker than usual. The hum of the old fluorescent lights above my head felt somehow more oppressive, like they were straining against something unseen. I had just finished checking on my last patient of the night, a frail elderly man who had been in a deep sleep when I entered his room. There had been no strange occurrences, no flickering lights or unexplained noises. But something in the pit of my stomach told me that this night would be different. I made my way back down the corridor, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. As I walked past room 207, the same room where I had experienced the strange noises before, I felt it again, a chill creeping down my spine, like invisible fingers brushing across my skin. I stopped, uncertain of whether I had heard something or if it was just my mind playing tricks. But then I heard it, soft at first, like the sound of someone breathing just beyond the door. It was not the shallow breathing of a patient asleep, but something else. The air around me seemed to grow heavier as I slowly approached the door, my hand trembling slightly as I reached for the handle. The door creaked open on its own, as if welcoming me into the room. Inside, the temperature had dropped significantly. I could see my breath in the cold air, the room shrouded in an eerie mist. The dim light from the hallway cast long shadows across the walls, making the room feel cavernous and oppressive. As I stepped inside, I noticed something that made my heart race. The chair that had once been empty was now occupied. But it wasn't a person sitting there. It was a figure, pale, almost translucent, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. Its body was shrouded in shadow, its features obscured by an unnatural darkness that seemed to seep from the very walls of the room. I froze. The figure didn't move. It just sat there, watching me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. My heart thudded in my chest, and I fought the urge to run. But something held me in place, a mixture of fear and fascination. The air around me felt charged, like a storm was about to break. Without thinking, I took a step forward. The floor beneath me creaked in protest, and the figure's head turned slowly, its empty eyes locking onto mine. My breath caught in my throat as I realized that it wasn't just a hallucination. It was real. Whatever it was real. "Why are you here?" I whispered, though the words barely made it past my lips. The figure didn't respond, but something shifted in the room. The temperature dropped even further, and the shadows seemed to grow darker, swallowing the light. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. I spun around, my pulse racing, but the room was as silent as ever. I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged in my chest as I banged on the door, shouting for help, but my voice felt swallowed by the oppressive silence. The figure in the chair shifted, its body twisting in unnatural ways. I could hear the sound of cracking bones, like a body being bent in ways it wasn't meant to go. It was a grotesque, horrifying sight. And then, with a soft, almost gentle motion, the figure rose from the chair. I stumbled backward, my body frozen in place, as the figure began to move toward me. Its movements were jerky, as though it were not fully in control of its own body. It was getting closer, closer with every step. And then, just as it reached out for me, the figure suddenly stopped. It stared at me for a long, agonizing moment, its hollow eyes locked onto mine. I could feel its presence pressing in on me, suffocating me, as if it were trying to pull something from me. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls drawing nearer as I felt my breath grow shallow. It was then that I heard the voice. It wasn't from the figure. It came from the room itself, from the very walls. A low, guttural whisper, like 1,000 voices speaking in unison. "Get out!" The words sent a shock through me, and for a brief moment, I was able to move again. My heart was pounding, my body trembling as I scrambled to the door. But the handle wouldn't budge. I was trapped. "Get out!" The voice grew louder, more insistent, and the room seemed to pulse with energy. I was no longer in control of my body, my limbs moving on their own, as if something was guiding me. The temperature continued to plummet, and I could feel the presence of something. Something ancient, something malevolent, closing in on me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I was consumed by the terror of what was happening. And then, just as the figure lunged toward me, the door burst open with a force so powerful that it sent me crashing to the floor. A bright light flooded the room, and for a moment, everything seemed to pause, like the world itself had frozen. I scrambled to my feet, my heart still racing, and looked up to find Catherine standing in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Her expression told me everything I needed to know. She had seen it too. Without another word, she grabbed my arm and pulled me out of the room. As we rushed down the hallway, I looked back one last time, but the room was empty again. The figure was gone, as if it had never been there at all. But I knew it had been real. It had been real. Catherine didn't speak until we reached the nurse's station, where she locked the door behind us. Her face was drawn, her hands shaking as she poured herself a drink of water. "I told you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I told you this place isn't what it seems. We're not the first ones to experience this. It's been happening for years." I was too shaken to respond, too overwhelmed by everything I had just seen. The weight of it all was crushing. The terror, the realization that something had been hiding in this hospital for far longer than any of us had imagined. It was all too much. As I sat there, trying to steady my breath, I knew one thing for certain. The hospital had a dark history, one that wasn't going to let us leave easily. And whatever had been watching us, whatever had been lurking in the shadows, was far from finished. The unsettling occurrences had reached a point where there was no ignoring them anymore. I'd barely been able to get a full night's rest for days. My mind would race with images of things I couldn't fully explain, and no matter how much I tried to push them away, they kept coming back, stronger, more vivid. The sense of dread weighed heavily on me, and the long, dark hallways seemed endless, stretching before me like a maze I couldn't escape. I had reached my breaking point. That night, it happened again. I had been doing my usual rounds, walking the same path I had taken countless times before. The lights flickered as usual, and the cold air still crept through the corridors. But this time, I could feel something else. It was different. A presence. Something more tangible. Something waiting. I walked past the room where Samuel had been the first night, and something caught my eye. The door was ajar again. But this time, the faint sound of scratching could be heard from inside, like nails dragging across the floor. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. My hand instinctively reached for the door, but something held me back. I couldn't move. I had learned to be cautious, to not let my curiosity get the best of me. But tonight, I felt like I had no choice. I had to see for myself. As I stepped inside, the room was bathed in an eerie, dim light. At first, it looked empty, just like before. But then, my eyes landed on the far corner of the room, where the chair sat, facing the wall. This time, however, there was something more. Someone, or something, was sitting in the chair. It wasn't Samuel. It wasn't a patient. It was something else. A figure, cloaked in shadow, with no visible features, no clear shape. Just darkness. The air around it seemed to shimmer, the temperature plummeting even further. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end as I stepped forward, unable to tear my eyes away from the figure. The room was deathly silent, but I could feel the weight of its presence. Something about it was wrong, unnatural. A deep, primal fear began to take root in my chest. My pulse hammered in my ears as I took another step, and that's when I saw it. The figure turned. Slowly. Its movements were unnatural, jerky, as if it were being manipulated by some invisible force. And then, for the first time, it spoke. Its voice was a low, guttural growl, almost unintelligible. But the words were clear enough. "You shouldn't be here." My blood ran cold. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The words echoed in my head as the figure rose from the chair, its form shifting and twisting, becoming more fluid, more disturbing. I stumbled back, my legs failing me as I crashed into the wall. My hands shook, and my heart felt like it was about to explode in my chest. That's when the door slammed shut behind me. I tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. The air around me felt thick, suffocating, as if the room was closing in on me. The figure was moving closer, its shape becoming more defined. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It had a face, a distorted, grotesque face. Its eyes were black, voids of emptiness, and its mouth stretched into an eerie grin. My breath came in short gasps, my body frozen in place, every instinct screaming for me to run. But I couldn't. I couldn't move. The figure reached out, its cold, bony hand grazing my cheek. I could feel the chill of it, like death itself had touched me. And then, in that moment, I heard a voice. A familiar voice, calling my name. It was Catherine. Her voice was faint at first, but it grew louder, desperate. "Get out of there. Now." In a panic, I scrambled toward the door, my hands trembling as I fumbled for the handle. And just as the figure was about to reach me, the door flew open. Catherine was standing there, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. She pulled me out of the room with surprising strength, slamming the door shut behind us. I could still feel the figure's presence, its cold grip on me, even as we ran down the hall. My heart was racing, my mind reeling from what had just happened. I didn't know if it was real or if I was losing my sanity, but I couldn't deny what I had felt. The terror, the darkness. Catherine didn't say a word as we ran. She didn't need to. She knew. She had seen it too. When we finally reached the nurse's station, she locked the doors and sat me down, her face a mask of grim determination. "This place. It's haunted," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I should have told you sooner, but I didn't want to scare you. People come here, and they never leave. Or if they do, they're not the same." I was shaking, still trying to process what had just happened. What was that thing? What did it want? Catherine's eyes were filled with sorrow. It's not just one thing. There's something dark in this place, something ancient, and it feeds on fear, on the lost souls of the hospital. It keeps them trapped here in the walls. She paused, as if gathering her thoughts. I've seen it before, a long time ago, and I've been trying to leave ever since. But it won't let me. It won't let any of us go. I looked at her, my mind racing. Then why haven't you left? Why haven't we all left? She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. Because it's too late for us. We're already part of it now. We can't escape. The weight of her words hit me like a punch to the gut. We were trapped. Trapped in a place where the past and present blurred, where the dead refused to leave. There was no escaping what had been set in motion. No resolution. Only the slow, inevitable pull of something dark that would claim us all in the end. I didn't speak for the rest of the night. What could I say? There was nothing to say. We had both seen it, felt it. We were trapped in the same nightmare with no way out. And I knew, deep down, that this would never end. No matter how far we ran, no matter how much we tried to forget, the darkness would always be there, waiting. The morning came, but the unease lingered. The hospital seemed like the same place, but everything had changed. I didn't want to leave, but I couldn't stay. Catherine was right. I had already become part of the story, part of the twisted history of this place. And no matter how hard I tried, I knew there would be no escaping it. The building would always be there, its secrets buried deep within its walls. And we would be nothing more than echoes, lost in the corridors of a hospital haunted by the past. The days following the final confrontation in the hospital felt like a blur. I kept replaying the events over and over in my mind, but no matter how many times I tried to make sense of it, the pieces didn't quite fit. The whispers, the strange sensations, the inexplicable occurrences, it all culminated in a terrifying night, one that I would never forget. But after that, everything stopped. It was as if the building, with all its secrets, had finally expended its energy, and the strange happenings came to an abrupt end. The flickering lights, the cold spots, the eerie shadows, none of it returned. I tried to leave the hospital as quickly as I could, unsure if I was running from the building or from the lingering fear inside of me. My colleagues, though a bit shaken by the strange events, seemed relieved that things had settled. It was as if they had all been waiting for it to end, but no one spoke of it directly. We all knew what had happened, but acknowledging it out loud felt impossible. The hospital never did get any better, but I left that place behind, as did most of the staff. A few months later, it was closed down entirely. The city claimed it was for budget reasons, but I knew better. The whispers about the building's history spread, and soon enough, no one would dare go near it. Some say the hospital was haunted by the spirits of patients who never left. Others claim that the building itself had been built on cursed land. There were rumors of mysterious disappearances, unsettling events, and strange occurrences that went on for years. But in the end, no one could explain it. No one wanted to. As for me, I've tried to put the whole experience behind me, but there are nights when I can still feel it, like a presence hovering just out of reach. I don't talk about it often, and I'm sure some people think I'm crazy for believing in what I saw. But there are some things you just can't unsee, and some places that refuse to be forgotten. So now, every time I pass an old hospital or an abandoned building, I can't help but wonder, what's really going on inside? What's hiding in the shadows, just beyond the edge of our vision? Some questions are better left unanswered, and some places, they should never be explored. Let me take you to a place far from your comfort zone, a place that, even now, I try to forget, but can't. This is a story about something that happened to me and a group of friends when we decided to take a weekend trip to a small, quiet town. It's a place most people wouldn't even look twice at, a place that felt like it had been stuck in time, with its old brick buildings and an eerie calmness hanging over it. But there was one building there, an old hotel, that no one spoke about. It all started with our plan to get away for the weekend. We were all looking for something simple, just a chance to relax, unwind, and leave behind the pressures of daily life. We all worked hard, and the idea of heading to a quiet town seemed perfect. The hotel we booked was one of the oldest buildings in the area, but that wasn't anything unusual. It was just a bit worn down, with peeling paint and an almost too quiet lobby. The main characters in this story were myself and 3 of my friends. I was the one who found the hotel online and made the reservation. It was cheap, which was a big draw for us since we didn't want to break the bank. I remember looking at the photos on the booking site, and while the rooms weren't the nicest, they seemed like they'd do for a short stay. It had a charm to it, old-fashioned, but in a way that seemed welcoming. What I didn't know at the time was that there was something hidden beneath that old charm. Something that would come to haunt us in the most terrifying way. Our group was close-knit, always up for an adventure, and we didn't take things too seriously. We didn't think much of the reviews on the booking website, the ones that mentioned strange noises and an uncomfortable atmosphere. We laughed them off, chalking them up to overly sensitive guests. But looking back now, I can't help but wonder if we were just too naive. Too eager to escape the hustle of everyday life to even notice the red flags. The ride there was uneventful. We passed through miles of open countryside with nothing but fields and the occasional gas station. There wasn't much to see except the occasional farmhouse. The further we got from the city, the more isolated everything seemed. The sun was beginning to set by the time we reached the town. The small buildings gave off a warm but somewhat eerie glow in the fading light. When we pulled up to the hotel, it seemed out of place. It stood at the edge of town, tall and imposing, with a Victorian-style architecture that hadn't aged well. The windows were large and dark, reflecting the dying sunlight, but they felt cold. The building loomed over us, casting a long shadow that stretched across the cracked sidewalk. There was something off about it, but I couldn't put my finger on it. As we approached the entrance, the air seemed to grow cooler. We shrugged it off, laughing nervously, and made our way inside. The lobby was just as strange as the outside, dimly lit, with a large chandelier hanging from the ceiling. It was old, yes, but it had a certain atmosphere that felt heavy. The reception desk was empty when we arrived, but the keys were neatly arranged in front of a guest book. It was strange how little interaction we had with the staff. The hotel had a sort of silent loneliness to it. The lobby was filled with old furniture, large armchairs, and faded carpets. The floor creaked as we moved around, and there was an odd smell in the air, like dust and something else, something metallic. It wasn't unbearable, but it was certainly unsettling. The kind of smell you couldn't ignore. We checked in, signed the guest book, and made our way up to our rooms. The staircase was narrow, and as I looked up at the darkened hall above, I felt an unfamiliar chill crawl up my spine. We joked about it, of course. We were all a bit nervous, but there was no reason to be. We were just staying in an old hotel for the weekend, after all. Nothing more. And yet, the feeling I couldn't shake lingered in the back of my mind. It felt like we were intruding, like the hotel didn't want us there. The rooms themselves were not great. They had that same old, tired charm, with faded wallpaper and furniture that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. But the beds were clean, and the showers worked fine. We settled in, unpacked, and then gathered in one of the rooms to start our weekend of relaxation. We were in high spirits, cracking jokes and catching up. Everything was normal, just as it should be. But that sense of unease remained, just beneath the surface. We didn't talk about it out loud, but we all noticed the same thing. The hotel felt wrong. It was as if it was watching us. That strange feeling was always there, lurking in the corners of our minds, but none of us said anything about it. Maybe we were too eager to push it aside and make the best of our trip. But the hotel didn't let us forget for long. The first strange event didn't hit us all at once. It wasn't some grand, terrifying spectacle. Instead, it crept up on us in subtle ways, so small that at first we weren't sure if we were imagining things or if the hotel was just a little too old for its own good. It started that night. After a few hours of hanging out in one of the rooms, talking and laughing, we decided it was time to get some sleep. We had a long day ahead of us, and the last thing we wanted was to be tired and cranky. As I lay in bed, trying to get comfortable under the thick, worn blankets, I couldn't help but feel that something was off. The room was too quiet, too still, like the hotel itself was holding its breath. I had a hard time falling asleep, which wasn't unusual for me, but this was different. My mind kept drifting back to the hotel's strange atmosphere, to that feeling that we were being watched. But I shrugged it off. I wasn't the type to believe in ghost stories after all. At some point during the night, I must have drifted off. It wasn't a deep sleep though. I was constantly shifting, uncomfortable in the stale air. I remember hearing faint sounds, the kind of noises you don't notice at first, but then can't ignore once they've registered in your mind. It was the sound of the floorboards creaking, the occasional soft thud, like someone was walking just outside my door. I opened my eyes. The room was still dark, and the only sound I could hear was the faint hum of the old air conditioner. My breath caught when I realized that there was something else, a sound that didn't fit, like a low whisper. It was quiet at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder the longer I lay there, straining my ears. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind or the house settling, but it didn't feel right. It wasn't like the usual creaks you'd hear in an old building. It felt deliberate, like someone, no, something, was standing just outside the door. I got up and opened it, expecting to find one of my friends standing there, playing a prank. But the hallway was empty. The air was cooler out there, and the lights flickered weakly above. There was no sign of anyone, no footsteps in the hall, no movement at all. I stepped back inside my room, locking the door behind me, and tried to shake off the feeling. I couldn't tell you exactly why, but I was uneasy, and the thought of lying down again didn't sit well with me. The next morning, I mentioned it to my friends over breakfast, laughing it off as a bad dream. But the moment I spoke, I could tell they knew what I was talking about. One of them, Mark, who was always the most skeptical of the group, mentioned that he'd heard strange noises too. He had even gotten up to check, but when he opened his door, everything was silent, just like it found. We all exchanged uneasy glances, but no one wanted to acknowledge the elephant in the room. We were in an old hotel after all, and things like this happened in old buildings, right? But it didn't stop there. The second night, we were a little more on edge, though we tried to convince ourselves that everything was fine. We decided to explore the town during the day and tried to enjoy ourselves. But there was always that lingering feeling, like we weren't really alone. We stopped at a small cafe for lunch, where the locals seemed distant, even cold. Their eyes would follow us as we moved about, but no one spoke. It was uncomfortable, to say the least, but we shrugged it off. The town was small, and maybe it was just their way of being private. Still, the sensation of being watched never quite went away. As night fell, we returned to the hotel, and that's when the second unsettling event occurred. We were all gathered in one room, playing cards and chatting. There was laughter, the kind of laughter that fills a room with warmth and lightens the mood. But then, the lights flickered. At first, it was subtle, just a brief dimming. But the longer we sat there, the more it happened. The lights would flicker and then return to normal, only to flicker again a few moments later. I was about to comment on how strange it was when the air seemed to grow heavier, as though the temperature had dropped suddenly. The room became cold, an unnatural chill that seeped into your bones. We looked at each other, not saying anything, but all wondering the same thing. Had anyone else noticed it? Was it just me? We all started fidgeting, trying to act normal, but the unease was growing, rising like a storm on the horizon. Mark stood up, seemingly unbothered. "It's just an old building. Probably an electrical issue," he said, trying to make light of it. But I could see the doubt in his eyes. He moved toward the window, pulling back the curtain to look outside. The street was empty, no one walking around. Everything looked quiet, too quiet. That's when we heard it. A loud bang, coming from the hallway. It sounded like something heavy had been dropped on the floor, a muffled thud that made us all jump. Our eyes met, and for a moment, no one moved. Then, as if on cue, we all stood up and walked to the door. We opened it carefully, half expecting to see something or someone on the other side. But again, the hallway was empty. It was as if the hotel itself was playing tricks on us, bending our perception of reality. The air was still cold, and the dim light from the overhead fixtures cast long shadows that stretched down the hall like fingers. "I don't like this," Mark said, his voice low. "Maybe we should leave. I've never been one for ghost stories, but this is starting to feel off." We all stood there in silence, considering his words. For a second, I thought we might pack up and leave. But as strange as it was, we couldn't bring ourselves to do it. Something held us there, something that made us believe that whatever was happening, it would somehow resolve itself. We shut the door again, and for the rest of the night, we tried to push aside our fears. But it was no use. The silence in the hotel felt heavier than ever. We each tried to sleep, but none of us truly rested. The next day, we decided to ask the receptionist about the noises and the strange happenings we'd been experiencing. She was an older woman with a stern face, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. She didn't say much, only nodding slowly when we asked if anything unusual had ever happened in the hotel. Her response was simply, "It's an old place. It has a history, but not one that I care to discuss." The way she said it made my stomach drop. We left the lobby feeling more unsettled than ever. It was clear the hotel wasn't just old, it had a story, a dark one that no one wanted to share. And from that moment on, it felt like we were being drawn deeper into something we didn't fully understand. The hotel wasn't just a place to stay, it was something more. The strange occurrences didn't stop after that night. In fact, they became more frequent, more insistent, until we were all on edge. It was as if the hotel was trying to force us to notice, to understand that something was terribly wrong. We couldn't ignore it anymore, and soon we found ourselves questioning whether this place was just haunted or whether it was something far worse. The air around us felt different. The light in the hallways flickered with increasing regularity, like the bulbs couldn't make up their minds whether to stay on or give up entirely. At night, the temperature dropped sharply, despite the heat being turned on in the rooms. The kind of cold that isn't just uncomfortable, it's the kind of cold that feels like it's seeping into your very bones, leaving you chilled to the core. The hum of the old air conditioning system grew louder, an unnerving sound that grated on our nerves, always humming in the background like it was alive. One night, as we sat in one of the rooms, discussing what we should do next, we heard it again, the sound of footsteps. They were faint at first, distant, but they grew louder, clearer. Someone or something was walking in the hallway. But when we opened the door, the hallway was empty. Nothing but darkness stretched before us. The silence that followed was suffocating. We all knew something wasn't right, but none of us knew how to explain it. We tried to push through, telling ourselves it was just the house settling, the noises of an old building. But the strange events only seemed to grow in intensity. It wasn't just the noises anymore, it was the feeling. It was like the hotel itself was alive, watching us, pressing in on us, suffocating us with its presence. We began hearing faint whispers, though none of us ever agreed on what was being said. It was always too quiet, too indistinct to make out, but the sensation of being surrounded by unseen eyes was undeniable. Mark was the first to suggest we investigate. We had to know what was going on. There had to be some explanation for it all. Maybe there was a gas leak causing the weird smells or the cold temperatures. Maybe the building was simply falling apart. But something in my gut told me that wasn't it. It was as if the place had a life of its own, and we were just living in it. The next day, after breakfast, we decided to take a closer look at the hotel. We gathered up our courage and started with the hallway. As we stepped out into the dimly lit corridor, the air seemed to shift. It wasn't just cold, it felt heavy, oppressive. The sound of our footsteps echoed unnervingly, as though the hallway was too quiet, too still for comfort. The walls were old and cracked, the wallpaper peeling in places, revealing the chipped plaster beneath. The floorboards creaked under our feet as we walked, and the flickering lights overhead gave everything an eerie, almost surreal quality. We made our way to the end of the hall, where there was a door we hadn't noticed before. It was tucked away in a corner, barely visible unless you were looking for it. The door was old, made of dark wood, its surface worn with age. It didn't have a handle, just a large, rusted latch. It seemed out of place, like it didn't belong with the rest of the hotel. There was a strange energy about it, a feeling that it shouldn't be opened. We hesitated, standing in front of it, unsure of what to do. It was almost as if the door was daring us to open it, to find out what lay beyond. Mark, ever the skeptic, was the first to speak. "This is ridiculous. There's probably nothing in there but junk. It's just an old storage room or something." But even as he spoke, I could tell he was uneasy. We all were. Still, curiosity won out. Mark grabbed the latch and pulled. The door creaked open with a protest, revealing a small, narrow room. The air inside was stale, thick with dust and neglect. It felt colder than the hallway, colder than it should have been. The light from the hallway barely illuminated the room, but it was enough to reveal the unsettling details. There were old wooden crates stacked in the corner, their surfaces coated in layers of dust. But what caught my attention was the wall. The far wall was covered in what looked like strange symbols, etched deeply into the wood. They weren't words, at least not in any language I recognized. They were intricate designs, spirals and lines that seemed to move, shifting the longer I stared at them. It was as if they were alive, writhing and twisting on the surface of the wood. My heart began to race, and I felt an unease that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "What is this?" one of my friends muttered, stepping forward to examine the symbols. But as he did, the temperature in the room seemed to drop even further, and I saw his breath mist in front of him. We all backed away from the wall, instinctively, as though it had become dangerous. As we retreated, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, and that's when I saw a shadow moving across the far corner of the room. It was quick, fleeting, but it was there. My pulse quickened, and I turned around, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever had moved. But there was nothing, just the empty, suffocating silence. "Let's go," Mark said quickly, his voice tight with fear. We didn't need to be told twice. We hurried out of the room and back into the hallway, but as soon as we stepped into the light, the temperature seemed to rise again, the air less oppressive. We stood there for a long moment, trying to process what had just happened. That was not normal," I said, my voice shaking. I wasn't sure if I was trying to convince myself or the others, but we all knew something had changed. The unease we had felt before had shifted into something darker, more real. The hotel wasn't just haunted, it was hiding something. And whatever it was getting closer. The rest of the day passed in a blur. We couldn't stop thinking about what we had found. The symbols on the wall, the shadow that moved, none of it made sense. The whispers seemed louder now, always just out of reach, like someone was trying to tell us something, but couldn't quite make the words clear. Later that evening, after another uncomfortable night in the hotel, we decided to confront the receptionist. She had seemed strange enough before, but now I couldn't shake the feeling that she knew more than she was letting on. When we asked her about the door, about the symbols we had found, her face went pale. For a moment, she didn't speak, just stared at us with wide eyes, as if weighing something heavy in her mind. "You shouldn't have gone in there," she finally said, her voice low and hushed. "Some things are better left undisturbed. It's too late now. The hotel has a history, and it's not a kind one." Her words were cryptic, and she refused to say anything more. She told us we had to leave, that we were better off not knowing. But by then, I knew we couldn't just walk away. Whatever was happening here, whatever we had uncovered, it wasn't going to let us go that easily. The next night was unlike any other. The tension that had been building up over the past few days finally reached its breaking point. We could feel it in the air, thick and heavy, pressing in on us as if the hotel itself was conspiring against us. The whispers that had once been faint were now clear, sharper, like voices speaking directly into our minds. They seemed to echo through the halls, coming from every direction, all at once. But when we looked around, there was nothing. Just the dark, empty space of the hotel, stretching on endlessly. It was around midnight when everything changed. We were in one of the rooms, talking quietly, trying to make sense of everything we had seen and felt. None of us spoke much about the symbols in the hidden room or the shadow we had glimpsed. It was too frightening, too impossible to put into words. But we were all thinking it, each of us silently acknowledging that whatever was happening in this hotel, it was no longer something we could ignore. I was sitting near the window, staring out into the darkness. The streetlights below cast long shadows across the pavement, and the world outside seemed so normal, so distant, as if it was separated from us by some invisible barrier. A soft breeze stirred the curtains, and for a moment I thought I saw something move in the reflection. But when I turned around, the room was still. It was just my imagination, I thought, my mind playing tricks on me. Then came the sound, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. They weren't like the usual creaks of the old building, the noise that could be explained away by the settling of the structure. No, these were deliberate, heavy steps, coming closer and closer. My heart skipped a beat. My friends must have heard it too, because we all froze, our eyes meeting in a silent understanding. We didn't need to speak to know what was happening. We had all felt it by now, the sense that we weren't alone. That the hotel wasn't just haunted by ghosts, but by something darker, something malevolent. The footsteps stopped outside our door, and for a moment, all was silent. Too silent. A suffocating kind of silence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Without a word, I stood and moved toward the door. The others followed, just as silently, though I could feel their fear as strongly as my own. When I reached for the doorknob, my hand trembled, but I forced myself to turn it. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but the dimly lit hallway. It was empty. No one was there. But that's when I saw it. At the far end of the hall, standing just beyond the edge of the light, there was a figure. Tall and thin, its features indistinguishable in the shadows. I couldn't make out whether it was human or something else entirely, but it was watching us. I could feel its eyes on me, piercing through the darkness, and I knew with a certainty that made my blood run cold that thing wasn't alive. It was something else, something ancient. I didn't have to say anything for the others to know. We all knew. Without a word, we stepped back into the room, slamming the door shut behind us. We stood there, frozen in place, too terrified to speak, too afraid to move. The air around us felt thick, as if the walls were closing in, and the temperature dropped sharply. My breath came out in shallow gasps, and I could see the others were just as panicked, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear. We huddled together, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but there was no sense to be made. We couldn't explain what we had seen, what we had felt. It was as if the hotel itself had taken on a life of its own, a malevolent presence that was no longer content to just haunt us from the shadows. It wanted us. It needed us. That's when we heard the voices again. This time, they were louder, clearer, and closer. The whispers became more distinct, no longer a jumble of incoherent sounds. They were calling to us, speaking words we couldn't understand, their tone dark and filled with malice. It was as if the hotel itself had turned against us, and we were trapped in a nightmare we couldn't escape. I turned to my friends, my mind racing. We had to leave. We had to get out of there. But as I reached for the door, something stopped me. A cold, unshakable feeling crawled up my spine, and I turned to see the shadowy figure again, now standing just outside the room. It was closer than before, its form becoming more distinct. The longer I stared at it, the more I realized just how wrong it was. It wasn't human, not in the way we understood it. Its eyes were hollow, empty voids, and its limbs were too long, too thin, like they had been stretched beyond recognition. And then it moved. The figure glided across the room, moving in a way that wasn't natural, that defied the rules of reality. It didn't walk, it drifted, its body flickering in and out of sight like it was made of smoke. My body locked up in terror, and I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. My friends were paralyzed too, unable to move, unable to speak. The air grew even colder, and I could feel my breath becoming shallow, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't hear anything except the pounding of my own pulse and the whispers, now louder than ever. Suddenly, the figure spoke. It wasn't a voice I could describe. It wasn't even a voice at all. It was more like a feeling, a deep, resonating force that vibrated through my entire body. The words it spoke weren't in any language I knew, but the meaning was clear. It was a warning that we had disturbed something we shouldn't have, something ancient and powerful. It told us, no, it demanded that we leave, that we never come back. But it wasn't done. The lights above us flickered violently, casting the room into darkness for a few seconds before they blazed back to life. When they did, the figure was gone, but the room was different. The air felt oppressive, thick with a sense of impending doom. And then we saw it. The symbols we had discovered in the hidden room, etched into the walls in a deep, dark red, were now glowing, faintly at first, then brighter and brighter, until the entire room was bathed in an eerie, unnatural light. The symbols were moving, shifting, just like I had seen in the hidden room. They were alive, and they were calling to us. The terror we felt at that moment was unlike anything I've ever known. We were trapped. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The hotel had claimed us, and we knew, in that instant, that it would not let us go easily. I don't remember much of what happened next. The terror, the confusion, and the overwhelming sense of dread made everything blur together. All I knew was that we had no choice but to leave the hotel. Whatever was happening, whatever had been unleashed, we couldn't stay there any longer. But as we fled into the night, leaving the hotel behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching us, waiting for us to return. And I knew, deep down, that we would never be freed. The dark sky loomed overhead as we hurried away from the hotel, our footsteps echoing on the empty street. Our hearts were racing, each of us too terrified to speak, but none of us could stop moving. The cold night air felt like a sharp slap against our skin, a cruel reminder that whatever had happened in that hotel wasn't over. It was far from over. As we walked faster, we glanced over our shoulders, half expecting to see the hotel's shadowy outline behind us, but it was just an ordinary street, stretching out into the quiet of the night. Still, we couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't free, not yet. We finally made it to the car. The engine sputtered to life, and the headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the road ahead. But no matter how far we drove, no matter how fast we tried to escape, there was an overwhelming sense of unease that never seemed to fade. The events of the past few days had left an indelible mark on all of us, and even as we got further away from the hotel, we knew that the nightmares would follow us. In the days that followed, none of us spoke much. The silence between us was thick, charged with an unspoken understanding that we had barely escaped something that was far beyond our comprehension. We tried to go back to our normal lives, but there was no normal anymore. The memories of that night haunted our every step, and no matter how much we tried to distract ourselves, we couldn't forget. The whispers, the shadows, the feeling of being watched. It lingered, a constant presence in the background of our thoughts. I couldn't help but wonder if the hotel had been playing with us all along. From the moment we arrived, there had been signs, subtle at first, but growing stronger, more intense, until we couldn't deny that something was wrong. What had been the point of all of it? Was it just to scare us, or was there something deeper, something more sinister at play? I couldn't answer that. None of us could. We did what we could to move on. We tried to act as though nothing had happened, but the unease stayed with us. It wasn't just the memories, it was the things that didn't make sense. Like the symbols we had found, which no one could explain, or the shadowy figure whose eyes still haunted me, even in the safety of my own home. Over time, I learned that the hotel wasn't just some place we had visited. It wasn't a fluke or a random occurrence. It had a history, one that was buried beneath layers of time, waiting to be unearthed. I spent hours researching, trying to make sense of the symbols and the figure we had seen, but all I found were fragments, scattered accounts of strange happenings in that very hotel. People had disappeared. Others had gone mad. But no one ever found the truth. The hotel had claimed them, just as it had claimed us. And then there was the moment when I found something that made my blood run cold. It wasn't a piece of information I was searching for, but it was a detail that had been staring me in the face the whole time. The names of previous guests, people who had stayed in the hotel, had begun to reappear in my life. Some of them I recognized from the past, people who had vanished after staying there. The coincidences were too strange, too unsettling to ignore. It was as if the hotel had a hold on them, just as it had a hold on me and my friends. We tried to go back, of course. Not all at once, but one by one, we ventured near the hotel again, curious but afraid. The first time, I drove past it. The place was still standing, just as it had been, but there was something different about it. It seemed wrong. The windows were blackened, and the building itself looked even more decayed, as if it had been abandoned for much longer than it truly had. There was no one around, no sign of life. It looked like it was waiting for us, just as it had waited for those before us. I don't know what I expected to find. Part of me thought we might uncover something, an answer, perhaps, or some explanation for the horrors we had endured. But when I stood there, looking up at the hotel, all I felt was dread. A deep, overwhelming sense that we had only scratched the surface of something much darker than we could understand. The others didn't go back, not even to look. We had seen enough, experienced enough to know that there was no going back. And I think, deep down, we all realized that we'd been lucky to make it out when we did. Whatever had been happening in that hotel, it was still happening. And it would continue to happen to anyone who walked through its doors. It was a cycle, a pattern that repeated itself over and over again, consuming all those who dared to investigate, who dared to question what lay hidden beneath the surface. Months passed, and life slowly started to return to some semblance of normal. But the nightmares never stopped. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest, feeling as if the shadows were creeping up behind me once again. And every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the whispers, faint but persistent, urging me to return, to face whatever had been waiting for me in that hotel. I began to realize something chilling. That night, when we fled, we hadn't truly escaped. The hotel had let us go, yes, but it hadn't finished with us. It had marked us, and I could feel it, the pull, the desire to lure us back. I could hear it, as though it was calling my name, just beyond the threshold of consciousness. It wasn't over. And so, as much as I wanted to forget, to move on with my life, I knew I couldn't. The hotel was still there, waiting. And one day, whether I liked it or not, it'd be forced to return. Because the hotel didn't let you leave, it only let you think you were free. We hadn't resolved the issue. We hadn't escaped. The question still lingered, unanswered, in the back of our minds. What was it that we had disturbed? What was the true nature of that hotel? And what would happen the next time, when it came for us again? In the end, there was no resolution, no closure. Just the constant, gnawing fear that someday, somewhere, we would have to face it once more. And when we did, I knew it wouldn't be like last time. It would be worse. It would be worse because we would be expecting it. And when we expected it, it would have the power to finish what it started. The hotel wasn't done with us. Not by a long shot. And that thought alone was enough to keep me up at night, forever haunted by the thing we had left behind. In the months that followed, I tried to rebuild my life, but there was always something lurking in the background. It wasn't the hotel itself that haunted me, not in the traditional sense. The building wasn't alive, not in any way I could explain, but it had a presence, something intangible, something that stayed with me long after I left its dark, oppressive walls behind. And perhaps that was what disturbed me the most. The fact that I could never quite shake the feeling that the hotel had never really let go of me. I couldn't go anywhere without seeing its shadow in the corner of my mind. It'd be walking down the street or sitting at a cafe, and suddenly, out of nowhere, it'd feel the familiar chill of the air. A cold that wasn't right. A cold that felt like it had come from somewhere deep, somewhere ancient, a place that existed far beyond the natural world. It'd snap my head around, searching, my pulse quickening, but of course, there would be nothing there. Just the ordinary, everyday world that had continued on as usual. But my heart would pound in my chest, and my thoughts would always return to that hotel. The more I tried to ignore it, the more intrusive it became. I stopped sleeping well, my dreams filled with disjointed images and sounds that I couldn't place. Whispers, footsteps, the flicker of candlelight in a darkened hallway. Sometimes I would wake up with the sensation that I wasn't alone. Like someone or something was watching me from the shadows. It was always the same. The unease that had gripped me during our stay at the hotel refused to let go. I tried to talk to my friends, the others who had been with me, but they were all struggling with the same feeling. It was as if we had shared some kind of unspoken trauma that no one else could understand. They too had been visited by nightmares, by the feeling of being followed. And although none of us wanted to admit it, we knew the truth, that the hotel hadn't released us. It had merely stepped back, waiting for the right moment to draw us back in. It wasn't until I spoke to someone else, an old friend of mine, a man I hadn't spoken to in years, that the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. He had heard rumors, he told me. There were others who had stayed in that same hotel, people who had come and gone long before us. And from what he had gathered, there was a pattern to the disappearances, the madness, and the strange occurrences that had been happening there. It wasn't just coincidence. It wasn't just bad luck. There was something far more sinister at work. I don't know why I hadn't connected the dots sooner. The hotel wasn't just some abandoned relic from the past. It was a place where things happened, where people went in and sometimes never came out. But the worst part was that they didn't have to die to be lost. The hotel didn't claim people's lives. It claimed their minds, their souls. It twisted them, slowly, until they were nothing more than shadows of who they once were. For a moment, I thought about going back, about confronting whatever it was that had so thoroughly ensnared us. I felt the pull, stronger than before, and the thought of it consumed me. It was almost as if I could hear it calling me. But then, something inside me snapped. The memories, the pain, the fear, they all came rushing back in an overwhelming flood. I could almost hear the whispers again, could almost feel the cold touch of the darkness creeping up behind me. I couldn't go back. I couldn't risk it. The hotel was waiting. I had no doubt about that. But if I returned, there would be no coming out. No answers. No escape. The hotel wouldn't let me leave a second time. Instead, I made a decision. I chose to let go. I had to. I couldn't spend the rest of my life running from the past. I had to accept that there were things beyond my understanding, things that I couldn't control. The hotel was one of them. The experiences it'd gone through, the fear, the madness, the whispers in the night, those things would never truly leave me, but I didn't have to let them consume me. I realized then that some stories, some experiences, don't have a neat conclusion. Not every mystery gets solved, and not every evil is vanquished. Sometimes we just have to keep moving forward, even when the shadows seem to stretch endlessly behind us. The hotel, whatever it was, would always be a part of my past, a dark chapter that I couldn't forget, no matter how much I tried. And as I sat there, thinking about the past, about the fear and the unanswered questions, I found myself with a quiet realization. Maybe, just maybe, that's how it had always been. The hotel was never about finding answers. It was about survival. It was about enduring the darkness and somehow making it out alive. Maybe the scariest part of it all wasn't the things we saw or the terror we felt. It was the fact that we had lived through it. We had survived. And as I closed my eyes that night, I knew that while the hotel would forever remain a shadow in my memory, I wasn't going to let it take any more from me. Because there was a world beyond that darkness, a world that I still had a chance to live in. That was the only victory I needed. The hotel hadn't won. It hadn't taken everything, and it never would. But that doesn't mean it'll ever forget. I'll carry the memory with me, a constant reminder of how close I came to losing myself. How close we all came to being consumed by something far beyond our understanding. And as long as I live, it'll never stop being grateful that I made it out. It was a rainy autumn evening when we set out on our road trip, a journey that would take us to one of the most isolated and eerie locations I've ever visited. I had always been a fan of lighthouses, their towering figures silhouetted against the endless ocean, standing firm and resolute, guarding the coast. Little did I know, this would be the trip that would forever change the way I saw them. My friends and I, there were 3 of us, had been looking for a getaway, something off the beaten path. We weren't looking for the usual weekend retreat or a noisy tourist spot. No, we wanted something more secluded, something quiet. That's when one of us, let's call him David, mentioned a lighthouse. He had read about it in a travel article, an old, abandoned one, far from the nearest town, perched on a rocky coastline that had been battered by years of storms. It sounded perfect, like a place where we could get away from everything. The lighthouse was in a remote part of the country, and reaching it meant traveling down winding roads that twisted through dense forests. It wasn't on any typical tourist route, and that made it all the more appealing. We drove for hours, not a soul in sight except for the occasional deer darting through the trees. The weather grew colder as we approached, the gray clouds above signaling the impending rainstorm. As we neared the lighthouse, the wind picked up, howling against the sides of our car, the rain beginning to tap rhythmically against the windows. There was a chill in the air that made me roll up the window despite the steam from the heater fogging the glass. The place looked just as we had imagined, desolate, the lighthouse looming like a sentinel, its stone structure weathered and cracked from years of exposure to the sea. We parked the car in front of the old keeper's house, a rundown building that seemed almost as ancient as the lighthouse itself. The overgrown weeds and cracked windows gave it an air of abandonment, and the silence surrounding it was almost suffocating. Not a single bird or insect made a sound. The wind howled through the trees, but that was it. There were 3 of us, David, Mike, and me. I'll admit, I was excited. I'd always loved the idea of exploring abandoned places. But I also had an odd feeling in the pit of my stomach. I couldn't explain it. Mike, always the skeptic, was already making jokes, poking fun at the idea of a haunted lighthouse. He'd made it clear he didn't believe in ghosts or anything supernatural, always brushing off things like that with a laugh. David, on the other hand, was quiet, taking it all in. He seemed to be genuinely intrigued by the place. A part of me thought he was hoping for something strange to happen. We unloaded our gear, setting up camp in the dilapidated keeper's house, its creaking floors and drafty walls only adding to the place's eerie atmosphere. There was no electricity, no running water, nothing modern. It was as if time had stopped there years ago. We were completely cut off from the world, and despite how cozy the fire in the hearth made the room feel, there was an undeniable sense of isolation. As night fell, the storm outside intensified. The wind battered the house, and rain lashed against the windows. It was the kind of storm that made you feel small and insignificant, trapped in the middle of nowhere. We sat around the fire, talking about anything and everything, trying to ignore the unsettling sounds that seemed to echo through the walls. It wasn't until later that night that things started to feel different. As we sat around the fire, the conversation naturally slowed, the warmth of the flames making us all drowsy. Mike, still unconvinced that there was anything unusual about the place, had taken to poking fun at old ghost stories, joking about how we were probably sitting on top of some haunted burial ground or an old shipwreck site. David and I exchanged glances, both silently agreeing that the jokes weren't really landing. The atmosphere had shifted from lighthearted to something more tense. At some point, David stood up, stretching his legs and yawning. "I'm going to check out the lighthouse," he said, his voice muffled by the sound of the storm outside. "Are you serious?" Mike laughed, clearly amused by the thought of trekking through the storm to explore an old, decrepit lighthouse in the middle of the night. "You can't be serious. It's pitch black out there, and it's probably flooding around the base of the thing." David simply shrugged, his eyes distant. "I'll be fine. I want to see what's really inside that place. Maybe he'll even climb to the top." I watched him head toward the door, his silhouette barely visible against the backdrop of the storm. The door creaked open, a gust of wind pushing it wider, and just like that, he was gone into the night. The sound of his footsteps faded quickly, swallowed by the wind and rain. Mike and I sat in silence for a moment, the crackling of the fire the only sound filling the room. Mike was still chuckling, but it was clear that his bravado had slipped a bit. "That guy's crazy. You're not going out there too, right?" I shook my head, unsure of what I was feeling. It wasn't fear, exactly, but something nagged at me, something subtle in the pit of my stomach. It was more like an instinct, something telling me to stay inside, to stay put. But then again, it wasn't like I had any real reason to be worried. It was just an old lighthouse. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. About 20 minutes passed. Mike had drifted into a sort of half-asleep stupor in the corner, while I stared into the fire, my mind racing. I could still hear the storm outside, the occasional crash of thunder that rattled the windows. And then, faintly, I heard something, footsteps. At first, I dismissed it, assuming it was just the wind. But the more I listened, the more it sounded like someone walking on the floor above us. The floor creaked in that slow, deliberate way, just like it had earlier when David had gotten up. I tried to ignore it, but the sound continued, echoing in the otherwise silent house. A soft thud, then a pause, and another thud. I stood up, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Mike, still oblivious, muttered something under his breath, clearly half asleep. "Mike," I said, my voice tight. "Did you hear that?" "Huh?" He stirred, blinking as if he had just woken from a nap. "Hear what?" "The footsteps. Above us." Mike rubbed his eyes, dismissing it with a yawn. "It's probably just the house settling, man. Don't start freaking yourself out." But even as he said that, he sounded unsure, like he was trying to convince himself more than me. But the footsteps persisted. They were deliberate, like someone was pacing around upstairs. I waited for them to stop, but they didn't. It went on for what felt like an eternity. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. My curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight from the corner of the room, shining it in Mike's face as he tried to protest. "I'm going upstairs," I said. "Stay here. I'll be back in a minute." Mike groaned, clearly annoyed. "This is stupid, but whatever. Don't say I didn't warn you." I climbed the stairs, the wooden steps creaking under my weight as I ascended into the dark upper floor. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, but the more I moved, the more I felt like I wasn't alone. It wasn't like the house had an oppressive presence, but there was something unsettling in the air. It felt thick, as if the shadows were closing in. I reached the top of the stairs and pointed the beam into the first room. It was just as I had expected, empty, dusty, nothing out of the ordinary. But the footsteps, they had stopped. I moved further into the room, shining the light on the floor, the walls, looking for something, anything that could explain the strange sounds. The floor was covered in dust, untouched, except for a few faint footprints in the dust near the window. My heart skipped a beat. The prints were fresh, too fresh for a house that had been abandoned for years. I turned quickly, feeling my pulse quicken. Something didn't feel right. There was a weight in the air, something that made it hard to breathe. I backed away, my eyes darting around the room, desperate to make sense of it all. And then, from behind me, I heard it. A soft, almost inaudible whisper, like someone calling my name. I froze. I spun around, but no one was there. The room was empty. I didn't wait any longer. I bolted for the stairs, rushing back down to the safety of the ground floor. My hands were shaking, my flashlight flickering with each step. When I reached the bottom, Mike was still sitting there, staring at me with a confused expression. "What's going on?" he asked, clearly irritated. I just shook my head, feeling my heart still racing in my chest. "I'll tell you later," I said. Let's just get some sleep." But even as I said that, I knew that sleep was the last thing I was going to get. The night dragged on, the storm outside relentless, the howling wind making the windows rattle in their frames. As I lay in bed, trying to calm my racing thoughts, the events from earlier kept playing over and over in my mind. The footsteps, the whispers, the feeling of being watched. No matter how I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, a lingering doubt gnawed at me, refusing to be ignored. Mike, ever the skeptic, had fallen asleep almost immediately after it returned downstairs, completely unfazed by the tension in the air. But I couldn't rest. My mind kept returning to the prints in the dust, the whisper that had sent a chill down my spine. Was it real? Had I imagined it all? Or was there something more sinister at play in that old lighthouse? I didn't sleep at all that night. I tossed and turned, the silence of the house broken only by the occasional creak of the old wooden beams groaning under the weight of the storm. When morning finally came, it wasn't much of a relief. The sun barely peered through the thick clouds, and the atmosphere felt heavy, oppressive. I tried to shake off the unease that had settled over me, but it was hard. Even as I stood in the kitchen making coffee, every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind felt like a reminder of the strange things we'd experienced so far. Mike, still groggy from a restless night, finally came downstairs, rubbing his eyes. "Dude, I don't know what your deal is, but you've been acting weird all night. Did you have a nightmare or something?" I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I walked over to the window and glanced out. The lighthouse was visible through the rain-soaked glass, its silhouette dark and imposing against the backdrop of the storm. It was hard to shake the feeling that it was watching us, waiting. "I think we need to go back," I said, my voice steady but low. "We need to figure out what's going on with that place." Mike raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "You're seriously going back in there after all that nonsense last night? Whatever you think you heard, it was probably just the house settling. You need to get over it." But something had changed in me. I couldn't let it go. I had to know what was happening, and I had to know the truth. I needed to understand what was behind the footsteps, the whispers, the prints in the dust. We finished our coffee in silence, the tension between us palpable. Mike wasn't as eager to investigate as I was, but he agreed to come along, mainly because he wanted to prove that there was nothing to be afraid of. As we made our way back toward the lighthouse, the rain had stopped, but the sky remained dark and overcast. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as we trudged through the wet grass, our boots sinking slightly into the mud with each step. The closer we got to the lighthouse, the more the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. When we reached the entrance, I hesitated for a moment, my heart thudding in my chest. I had no idea what we might find inside, but I knew it wasn't going to be good. Mike, on the other hand, was grinning like he had just won a bet. "See, nothing to worry about," he said, pushing the door open with ease. "It's just an old lighthouse, man. No ghosts, no monsters, just a bunch of old junk." The door creaked as it swung open, the hinges protest the movement. The smell of dampness and mildew hit me immediately, along with the overwhelming sense of decay. The air inside was thick with the smell of dust, the scent almost suffocating. The beam of our flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the same old wooden stairs that I had climbed the night before. The same creaks, the same shadows, but something felt off. I led the way, my flashlight sweeping across the room. The once beautiful lighthouse had become little more than a forgotten relic, its walls covered in peeling paint, its wooden floors warped and cracked. But there was a stillness in the air now, something unnatural, as though the house was holding its breath, waiting for us to make the next move. We climbed the stairs in silence, the only sounds the faint creaks of the floor beneath our feet. As we reached the top, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. There was something, or someone, up here with us. I couldn't explain it, but I felt it in my bones. Mike seemed unfazed. "This is it, huh? The big mystery." He waved his hand dismissively, as if he were exploring just another old, abandoned house. But his eyes darted around the room, as though he were looking for something. I stepped into the room, my flashlight beam landing on the same dust-covered floor. There was something strange about it this time, something different. The prints were still there, But now there were more of them, dozens scattered across the floor, leading toward the window. This wasn't here last night, I whispered to myself, more to confirm my own thoughts than to speak to Mike. Mike stepped forward, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, his footsteps echoing. Maybe someone's been in here. Who knows? Could just be animals or something. I spun around, my flashlight shaking in my hand. But there was nothing there. Nothing except a cold, empty room. Mike, clearly feeling the tension, laughed nervously. Okay, this is getting weird. Maybe it's time to head out. I think we've seen enough. But I wasn't ready to leave, not yet. There was something I hadn't checked, something I had to see. The note was handwritten in what looked like faded ink, the words barely legible. Don't let it in. I stood frozen, the words burning in my mind as the silence around me grew heavier. Something was definitely wrong with this place, and whatever was here, whatever had been watching us, was far from finished. My heart raced as the words on the paper burned into my mind. Don't let it in. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. The heavy silence of the room seemed to press down on me, smothering me, as though the walls themselves were closing in. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. Behind me, I heard Mike's voice, shaky and uncertain. Dude, what's going on? What's that note say? I turned to him, my eyes wide, the paper still clenched tightly in my hand. It says, "Don't let it in." My voice cracked as I spoke, barely above a whisper. What the hell does that mean? Mike frowned, his face a mixture of confusion and concern. What do you mean, don't let it in? Who wrote that? And what does it even mean? He took a step forward, peering over my shoulder at the note, his flashlight beam flickering. I couldn't answer him. The fear had taken hold of me, wrapping its icy fingers around my chest. I looked around the room again, my breath shallow and erratic. Every corner seemed darker, the shadows deeper, as if something was waiting there, just out of sight, biding its time. Suddenly, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I froze. A noise. A faint creaking sound, like the shifting of something heavy. It came from the far corner of the room, near the window where the prints had led. Mike didn't hear it at first, but I was already moving before he could speak. I moved toward the corner, my flashlight shaking in my hand as I aimed the beam into the darkness. My heart thudded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. As I reached the spot, I glanced down, and then my blood ran cold. The floor was no longer empty. The prints, they were still there, but now there were fresh ones, darker than before, and they led straight to the window. My breath hitched as the air in the room suddenly felt colder, a bone-deep chill that made my teeth ache. I took another step forward, my mind racing, trying to process what was happening, but it was too much. The prints, they weren't just on the floor anymore. They were climbing the walls, snaking their way up the side of the room, as if someone or something had crawled across the space. Mike, I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. Mike, we need to leave. Now. Mike turned to me, his eyes wide with uncertainty. But before he could respond, a loud bang echoed through the room, followed by another, and then the unmistakable sound of something heavy scraping across the floor. I felt it then, like a presence, moving just behind me, but when I turned, there was nothing there. It was then that I heard the whisper, low and distorted, slithering into my mind. The same whisper I'd heard the night before. Don't let it in. The words seemed to echo in the very air around me, reverberating in my skull. I turned toward Mike, but his face was pale, his mouth slightly open in shock. What the hell was that? He whispered, his voice barely audible. His eyes darted around the room, panic creeping into his expression. What? What is that? I didn't have the words. I couldn't explain it. But I knew one thing for sure. Whatever was happening here, whatever was in this lighthouse, wasn't normal. It was as if the house itself was alive, breathing, watching us. Then, As if to confirm my darkest fears, the temperature in the room plummeted, and I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, a shadow moved across the wall. At first, it was just a flicker, a passing shape, but then it grew longer, darker, more defined. I turned toward the window, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The shadow twisted and writhed, taking form. It was a figure, tall and thin, with long, spindly limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its face was obscured, a blur of darkness, but the feeling of dread it exuded was unmistakable. Mike gasped, his voice cracking. "What? What is that? What's going on?" I could barely speak. The figure in the corner seemed to stretch, its arms reaching out toward us. My legs felt like jelly, my body frozen in place as it moved closer, its presence suffocating, oppressive. And then the figure stepped forward, its feet making no sound on the floor. It was close now, too close. I could feel its eyes on me, even though it didn't have a face. It was as if it was watching my every move, studying me, waiting for me to make a mistake. A sudden realization hit me like a ton of bricks. The thing in the corner wasn't just some ghost. It wasn't a figment of my imagination or a product of stress. This was something real, something ancient, something that had been here long before us, and it was not going to let us leave. Mike stepped back, his face a mask of terror, his hand trembling as he pointed toward the door. "We have to go. Now." I couldn't move. My legs wouldn't respond, my mind racing with fear and disbelief. I tried to speak, to say something, but the words caught in my throat. Then the thing in the corner began to move again, its long skeletal hand reaching out toward us, its fingers curling in a slow, deliberate motion. The whispers came again, louder this time, more urgent. "Don't let it in." It was at that moment that the full horror of what was happening hit me. This thing, this presence, wasn't just haunting the lighthouse. It had been waiting for someone to open the door, to let it in. And we had done just that. I snapped out of my paralysis, my body finally obeying me. I turned and bolted toward the door, my heart racing in my chest. Mike was right behind me, but the thing, whatever it was moving faster now, its form distorting, twisting as it chased us. The walls seemed to close in on us, the hallway growing narrower, the air thicker, more suffocating. As we reached the door, I felt it, cold hands, icy and unnatural, grip my shoulders, pulling me back. I screamed, fighting against the pull, but it was no use. I could feel the weight of it, the pressure, the darkness closing in on me. But then, in a moment of pure instinct, I wrenched the door open and shoved Mike outside, stumbling into the cold, stormy night. The door slammed shut behind us, but I could still feel the weight of it, as though it were watching us, waiting for us to return. We didn't stop running until we reached the safety of the car, our breaths ragged, our hearts still pounding. We drove away, the lighthouse disappearing in the rearview mirror, but I knew deep down that whatever we had encountered in that place wasn't gone. It was still there, waiting, lurking in the shadows of the lighthouse. And as the storm raged on, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before it found us again. The drive away from the lighthouse felt like it lasted forever, but it wasn't the physical distance that weighed on me. It was the crushing sense of dread that clung to me. As we sped through the winding roads, my mind replayed the events over and over, each detail burning itself deeper into my memory. The whispers, the figure, the cold, icy touch that had almost dragged me back into the darkness. I could feel the weight of it, the unshakable feeling that the thing was still out there, watching us. Mike had said little since we left the lighthouse. His knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, his eyes darting nervously between the road and the rearview mirror. Every now and then, he would glance at me, but there was no comfort in his gaze, just the same terror I felt. The silence in the car was deafening. "Do you think we're safe?" I asked quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. Mike didn't respond right away. He kept his eyes on the road, his jaw clenched tightly, as though he were fighting to keep his composure. When he did speak, his voice was strained, almost hollow. "I don't know," he said. "I don't think we're safe anywhere." The idea that the thing wasn't bound to the lighthouse, that it could follow us, chase us. It gnawed at me like a sickening thought that I couldn't escape. I kept looking out the window, half expecting to see that twisted figure standing in the shadows, just watching us from the roadside, waiting for the right moment to strike again. But the longer we drove, the more the darkness outside seemed to stretch on, empty and silent. When we reached the nearest town, we pulled into a small, dingy motel. The place had a faded neon sign that flickered in the rain, casting a sickly glow over the parking lot. The building looked abandoned, like it hadn't seen a guest in years. But at that point, I didn't care. I just needed to get out of the car, to put some distance between myself and that damn lighthouse. We checked in quickly, and the manager didn't seem to take much interest in us. He was an older man with a tired face, his eyes distant and blank. As he handed us the room key, he mumbled something about the storm being bad tonight, and we nodded in agreement, too exhausted to ask any questions. We just wanted to be left alone. Once we were inside the room, I collapsed onto one of the beds, my legs weak and shaky from the tension of the past hours. Mike went straight for the window, pulling the blinds aside and scanning the parking lot below. "Think we're being followed?" I asked, sitting up slightly, the unease still twisting in my gut. "I don't know," he muttered, "but it feels like we are." We sat in silence for what felt like an eternity. I kept expecting the door to burst open, for that thing to come pouring through, but nothing happened. The only sound was the relentless tapping of rain against the window, the wind howling outside. We were safe for now. After a long time, Mike finally spoke, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. I stared at him, my heart sinking. "You're insane," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We just escaped that place, Mike. You saw what happened. That thing, whatever it is, tried to kill us. And now you want to go back? It's the only way to stop it," Mike insisted, his eyes wide with a strange intensity. "If we don't go back and figure this out, it's never going to stop. It'll keep following us, and it'll keep hurting us. We have to end it." I shook my head. I couldn't process what he was saying. It was too much. We had narrowly escaped with our lives, and now Mike wanted to walk right back into the mouth of hell. The idea made my stomach churn, but part of me knew he was right. We hadn't really escaped, had we? The whispers, the figure, that unrelenting presence, it wasn't over. It was just waiting. "I don't know if I can go back," I admitted, my voice shaking. "I don't know if I can face that thing again." Mike looked at me, his expression softening for a moment. "I know. I don't want to either, but we don't have a choice." We spent the rest of the night sitting in that room, our minds racing, our fears still clinging to us like a second skin. The storm outside raged on, the wind howling as if it, too, were urging us to make a decision. But by morning, we knew what we had to do. We couldn't run forever. If we didn't face whatever haunted that lighthouse, it would haunt us forever. The drive back was silent, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. The storm had finally passed, but the sky remained a dull, oppressive gray. The lighthouse loomed in the distance, like a dark sentinel waiting for us to return. My stomach twisted as we pulled up to the edge of the cliffs once more. Mike turned off the engine, and we both sat there, staring at the lighthouse, the waves crashing violently below. We had come this far. Now, we had to face the thing we had brought into our lives. With a deep breath, I stepped out of the car, my legs trembling beneath me. The air was cold, biting, as I walked toward the entrance of the lighthouse. I didn't look back, didn't dare to. I couldn't let myself. Whatever happened, I knew we had to finish it. We walked up the creaking stairs, our steps slow and measured. The place was just as we had left it, empty, abandoned, and yet not. There was something in the air, something that pressed against my skin, that whispered to me in ways I couldn't understand. And then, there it was, the thing that had followed us. The dark figure, standing at the top of the stairs, waiting for us. Its form twisted and distorted in the dim light, its long arms reaching out, beckoning us forward. Mike gripped my arm, his face pale with fear. "It's here," he whispered. I nodded, too scared to speak. There was no escaping it now. The only choice left was to face it, to confront whatever evil we had unleashed. But as I stepped closer, I saw it, the truth behind the whispers, behind the darkness that had haunted us. It was never meant to be defeated. It was meant to be left alone. The silence in the lighthouse was overwhelming as the dark figure loomed before us. Its presence was suffocating, like an oppressive weight pressing on my chest, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. The air felt thick with an ancient energy, one that didn't belong in the world we knew. It was something older, something darker, something that had been waiting for us to come back and finish what we had started. Mike stood frozen beside me, his body rigid, his face pale, but his eyes were wide with a realization I had been avoiding. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't here to harm us directly. It wasn't something that could be fought, not in the way we thought. It had been there long before us, and it would be there long after we were gone. I had always believed that the scariest things in life were the things we didn't understand, the unknowns that lurked just outside the reach of our comprehension. But this was different. This was something far older, something that didn't rely on fear or terror to control us. It simply existed, and in its existence, it consumed everything. I couldn't make sense of it. We had been so focused on fighting it, on escaping it, that we had forgotten the most important truth. It wasn't here for us. It didn't care about us. We were just passing through, like so many others who had come before us. The lighthouse had always been a place of death, a place where people's souls had been lost in time. And we were no different. Our arrival had been inevitable, just another chapter in its long, dark history. Mike finally spoke, his voice a strained whisper. "It's not going to stop. It's never going to stop." I nodded slowly, my mind spinning. He was right. No matter how hard we tried, we couldn't escape what we had unleashed. There was no closing the door, no running away. The only thing left was to accept that it had been too late from the start. We had been part of something much bigger than ourselves. The figure, still standing motionless, seemed to sense our acceptance, or perhaps it had been waiting for this moment all along. There was no rush, no sudden movement, just an overwhelming stillness that settled in the room, heavy and suffocating. Time seemed to slow, each passing second stretching into eternity as we stood there, staring into the abyss of what had come for us. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The air cleared, the oppressive weight lifted, and the lighthouse seemed quieter. The shadows in the corners of the room no longer felt alive, and the cold, unnerving chill that had clung to us was replaced by a strange calmness. It was over, not because we had conquered it, but because it no longer needed us. When we finally left the lighthouse, we didn't look back. There was nothing left for us there, and we knew that even if we wanted to, we could never return to the lives we had before. The world we knew, the world of comfort, of normalcy, had been forever altered. The night was no longer the same. The stars no longer seemed as bright. We had seen something that could never be unseen. Years later, when I found myself driving along the same stretch of road that had led us to that cursed place, I couldn't help but feel the unease settle back in. The lighthouse was still there, perched on the edge of the cliffs, just as it had been before. I drove past it, my eyes never straying to the side, my hands tight on the steering wheel. It was as if the very sight of it could call the darkness back into my life, and I wasn't ready to face that again. The world keeps spinning. People come and go. Time moves forward, and life continues in its usual rhythm. But for me, nothing was ever the same. That night in the lighthouse had changed me in ways I couldn't explain. I learned that some things are not meant to be understood, not meant to be challenged. Some things are ancient, eternal, and simply waiting for the right moment to make their presence known. We were just unfortunate enough to stumble into their path. I never went back to that part of the coast. I never spoke to Mike again. We both moved on, but the memory of the lighthouse stayed with me, lingering like a shadow that I could never quite shake. And every now and then, when the wind howls in the distance, when the night is dark and heavy, I still feel the cold touch of the thing that once haunted that lighthouse. It was never meant to be escaped. It was always meant to be left alone. Now, let's get into it. I've been wanting to share this story for a while. It's not one of those wild, out there tales of the supernatural that you hear in the movies or read about in books. No, this happened to me and a few friends, and it wasn't something we could just shrug off and say, nah, it was just a coincidence. What I'm about to tell you happened one evening on a lonely, forgotten stretch of road that was anything but empty. This took place a few years ago. It was one of those summer nights when the heat never seems to completely dissipate, and the air feels heavy with the kind of stillness that makes your skin crawl. I had just gotten off work, a regular day, nothing special. My mind was tired, my legs sore from standing for hours, and I was just looking forward to going home and crashing. But, as usual, I couldn't help but notice that my friends never seemed to have the same idea when it came to winding down. We all had the same urge, go for a drive. The kind of drive where you just keep going, letting the road take you wherever it might lead. We had all been friends for years, having grown up in the same town. It wasn't a huge place, small enough where everyone knew everyone, and there was always something to do, even if that something was a bit out of the ordinary. I guess that's what happens when you live in a place where the most exciting thing on the agenda was driving to a gas station just to get a soda and chat about nothing in particular. The group that night was myself, two of my closest friends, and a couple of others who had known for years. We had a tight-knit circle, and nothing ever really seemed too out of the ordinary when we were together. Our nights were spent aimlessly driving, talking about everything and nothing at all. On this particular night, we had decided to take an unfamiliar road, one that none of us had been down before. It wasn't an old highway or anything that might raise a red flag. It was just a winding stretch of road, isolated from the main town. As we drove, I remember thinking it felt eerie, but not in the way you might imagine. It wasn't because it was dark or silent. It was because the road seemed to go on forever, like it was endless, with nothing but trees on either side. It was too quiet, too empty. There was no sign of life, not a house or another car in sight. We didn't really think anything of it at first. It was just a road after all. But the further we went, the more uneasy I started feeling. It wasn't anything you could really pinpoint, just a feeling in the pit of my stomach. The others didn't seem to notice though. They were laughing and joking, talking about the latest TV shows and sports games. We were in the car for a while, maybe 30 minutes, before something started to feel wrong. There was a certain tension building, like the air was becoming thicker. Something about the way the headlights of the car cut through the darkness, illuminating just enough of the road ahead, felt off. It felt like we were driving straight into the unknown, but I didn't say anything at first. After all, it was just a road, right? And yet, in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. As we continued down the road, there wasn't much else to focus on besides the occasional turn and the sound of our tires rolling over the asphalt. The trees that lined both sides were thick and seemed to close in on us more and more. It was like nature itself was trying to swallow the road whole. That might sound dramatic, but it was true. The trees felt too close, the road too narrow, and there wasn't a single sign of civilization in sight. We'd passed a couple of old, rusted-out signs earlier, but nothing that made us feel like we were still anywhere near a real town. This was just. It felt wrong, but none of us were brave enough to admit it. And that's when the first incident happened. I didn't know it at the time, but I look back now and realize it was the first sign that things weren't as normal as they seemed. We were all chatting when suddenly the car seemed to slow down without any reason at all. It wasn't the kind of slow that comes from hitting the brakes. It was as if the engine itself just lost power. It lasted for a split second, but long enough for all of us to notice. We looked at each other, a bit confused. No one had touched the brake or the gas pedal, but the car had slowed, almost as if we were losing speed for no apparent reason. I was in the passenger seat, glancing over at my friend who was driving, and I could see his expression change. It wasn't much, but I could tell something wasn't right. His hand gripped the wheel a little tighter, and his eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, like he was expecting to see something behind us. But, of course, there was nothing. No other cars, no lights from another passing vehicle, just darkness. Still, we all brushed it off as nothing, chalking it up to the car acting funny. No one said anything about it, not even the driver, but I could tell from the way the atmosphere had shifted that everyone was feeling it too. That strange unease, that pull in the pit of your stomach, had started to grow. The kind that makes you question whether you're really alone. But we kept driving. After all, it wasn't like we could just turn back. The road stretched on ahead, and no one wanted to seem paranoid. Little did we know, this was just the beginning. But I'll tell you about what happened next when we get to the second part of the story. We had driven for what felt like hours, but when I glanced at my watch, it had only been about 45 minutes since we took the turn onto that abandoned road. The feeling of unease was starting to settle deeper, but no one said anything out loud. We all just carried on, silently ignoring the fact that the world around us seemed increasingly unfamiliar, strange in ways we couldn't articulate. The night was thick with that suffocating silence. Even the usual sounds of night, crickets chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze, seemed muted here. The trees, now so dense on either side, made it impossible to see any farther than a few feet ahead. It felt like we were trapped in a never-ending tunnel of darkness, with only the dim glow of the headlights pushing back the blackness. The road seemed to stretch on and on with no end in sight. None of us said anything for a while. We just kept driving. Then it happened. We were coming around a sharp bend when I felt it, a sudden, eerie chill that ran through the car. It was subtle at first, just a slight drop in temperature that made me shiver. But then the chill deepened, and for a second, it felt like the air had been drained of all warmth. I glanced over at the others, and I could see their breath in the air. It was like someone had turned on an invisible air conditioner in the car, and yet the night outside didn't feel cold enough for that. We all noticed it, even though no one mentioned it out loud. There was something unnatural about it. The windows were rolled up, and yet there was no way the outside temperature could have caused the air to shift like that. It didn't feel like just a cold draft. There was a heaviness to the air, as if something was pressing down on us from all directions. But we didn't say anything. We couldn't put our finger on it, and none of us wanted to be the first to speak up and suggest what we all might have been thinking. And then, just as quickly as the chill arrived, it was gone. But the feeling didn't leave. It lingered, hanging in the air like a thick fog, clouding our thoughts. The car seemed to slow again, just for a moment, as if something was preventing us from moving any faster. We weren't on an incline or anything, and we weren't running low on gas. It didn't make sense. But the car crept along, moving as though something was tugging at it, pulling it down. I looked at the driver, hoping he'd say something to ease the growing tension. But his eyes were fixed on the road ahead, his jaw set, and his hands tight on the wheel. I could see his grip tightening even more, his knuckles going white. The others were silent, but I could tell they felt it too. I didn't need to hear it. The way they shifted in their seats told me everything. "We should probably turn around," I finally said, breaking the silence. My voice was hoarse, though, like I wasn't sure if I truly believed the words I was saying. It felt like I was trying to reassure myself more than anyone else. "Yeah," another friend, sitting in the back, spoke up. "This road feels off. Like, really off." The driver didn't respond at first. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror again, scanning the dark stretch of road behind us. There was nothing there, just the endless expanse of trees and the faintest outline of the road beneath the headlights. No other cars, no signs of life. The road seemed completely empty. "We'll be fine," he muttered after a moment, his voice tense but trying to sound confident. He gave the wheel another squeeze and pressed the accelerator down a little harder. I wasn't the only one who felt it. Everyone else in the car seemed to shift uncomfortably in their seats, all of us trying to ignore the strange, uneasy sensation building up in the air. But no matter how hard we tried to brush it off, it was impossible to ignore. The weight of something unseen hung over us, making every breath feel labored, every movement feel like we were being watched. The driver's eyes darted back to the road ahead, his foot hovering over the gas pedal. Just as I was about to suggest again that we turn around, something caught my attention. A figure! At first, I thought it was just a shadow, something that the headlights had illuminated for a split second. But as we drew closer, I realized it wasn't a shadow at all. There, standing on the side of the road, was a person. Just standing there, completely still. It was strange, unnerving, like they had been waiting for us. The figure was dressed in dark clothing, and their face was hidden in the shadows. I couldn't make out any details. The car slowed again, as though both the driver and the car itself were reluctant to pass the figure. "What the hell?" one of the others muttered, craning his neck to get a better look at the person. The driver hesitated, his foot lifting slightly off the pedal. "Should we stop?" he asked, his voice unsure. "No," I said quickly. I didn't want to stop. "Not here, not on this empty road. Just drive past. Don't stop." The driver gave a nervous glance at the others, but none of us said anything more. He stepped on the gas, and we moved past the figure. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I couldn't help but look over my shoulder, trying to catch another glimpse of the figure in the rearview mirror. There was nothing, just empty road. But that didn't make me feel better. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. We kept driving, and I swear I could feel the weight of the eyes of that figure following us, even as we passed them. No one spoke for a while. It was as if we were all processing the same strange, unsettling feeling, but none of us knew what to say. The silence in the car was deafening now. Even the tires on the road seemed quieter, as though the car was trying to muffle the sound of the eerie quiet that surrounded us. Then, as if to break the tension, the radio flickered to life. It wasn't the static hum that usually came with a dead station. No, this time it was different. The sound was distorted, warbled, like someone was trying to speak through the static. I could hear what seemed like voices, low, unintelligible murmurs at first, but then they began to sound clearer. I turned to look at the others, but no one moved. No one even blinked. The voices, if you could call them that, grew louder, more pronounced. It was like they were speaking directly to us, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest. Then, without warning, The radio went silent. The driver slammed his fist on the dashboard. What the hell was that? And that's when it became clear. This wasn't just some eerie coincidence. We weren't alone on that road. Someone was out there, watching us. But what it was, we still couldn't understand. The road was endless. The trees on either side pressed in closer now, their twisted limbs reaching toward the car like skeletal hands, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across the road. The air, heavy and stagnant, carried a strange smell, not quite rotten, but sharp, almost metallic. Every breath I took felt unnatural, like I was inhaling something more than just oxygen, something else, something older, something dark. We had passed that figure, and yet the eerie feeling hadn't gone away. If anything, it had intensified, wrapped itself around us like a suffocating blanket. The tension was palpable. It wasn't just the oppressive silence, it was the feeling that something or someone was getting closer. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see a pair of eyes watching us from the shadows, but there was nothing there. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation of being followed. The car crept forward at a snail's pace. The headlights, barely cutting through the dense darkness ahead, seemed to get dimmer with every passing minute. It was like the night itself was swallowing the light, inch by inch, until we were left with only the faintest glow. The driver kept his eyes fixed on the road, but I could see his fingers twitching on the wheel, his jaw clenched tight. The others, too, were visibly uneasy. Their gazes flicked nervously between the trees, the road, the rearview mirror. No one spoke, but the air in the car was thick with the weight of unspoken thoughts. Then, just as I thought I might lose it from the suffocating silence, something happened. A faint tapping. At first, I thought it was just the wind, a stray branch brushing against the car. But then it came again, louder this time, and it was coming from inside the car. I turned to look, my heart racing. At first, I didn't see anything. But then I noticed the windows. One of them was cracked. I could feel a draft, and the tapping was growing more pronounced, like someone was gently tapping on the glass from the outside. My eyes shot to the rearview mirror again. The road was still empty, nothing but the endless stretch of dark trees. I felt my throat tighten. Did anyone hear that? I asked, trying to sound calm, but my voice was shaky. No one responded right away. The driver glanced over at the others, his face pale. One of the others in the back seat muttered, "I didn't hear anything," but I had heard it. The tapping was still there, though now it was quieter, too quiet. I wanted to ask if anyone else had heard it too, but my words got stuck in my throat. I swallowed hard. "Turn on the radio," someone suggested. It was the only thing that could break the heavy silence. The driver fiddled with the knobs, his fingers trembling. When the radio came on, it was the same as before, static. But this time, it wasn't the usual hiss of a dead station. This time, it was different. A deep, guttural sound mixed with the static, like a distorted voice trying to get through. The words were garbled, too faint to make out, but there was something distinctly wrong about it. My heart was pounding now. I couldn't sit still, my legs bouncing under the seat, my fingers gripping the edge of the door. I had to say something, but nothing came out. The air felt heavier still, like something was pushing down on us, smothering us. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the static stopped. The car was completely silent. The radio went quiet. The tapping outside ceased. But the feeling of something watching us didn't. It was like the night had become more alive, more present, pressing in from all sides. It was in the way the trees seemed to move in the corner of my eye, in the unnatural stillness of the air, in the soundless way the road seemed to stretch on forever, with no end in sight. The driver's eyes were wide now, his breath shallow. He was trying to keep it together, trying to stay calm, but I could see the fear in his movements. The tension in the car was suffocating, and I knew we couldn't just keep driving down this road forever. "We need to stop," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. No, the driver's voice was sharp. We're almost there. The there he referred to was some old farmhouse we were supposedly going to. I didn't know if it was still standing, but we needed something to take our minds off the terrifying unknown surrounding us. We hadn't seen another car in what felt like forever, and there was no sign of any other life out here. The road was empty, lifeless, and every time I looked out of the window, it felt like something was waiting for us to make a wrong move. And then it happened again. This time, there was no mistaking it. A figure, clearer this time, standing at the edge of the road. I could make out its shape, but not its face. Just a shadow of a person, too tall to be human. It stood there, motionless, as if waiting for us to pass. As we got closer, I saw its arm raised, pointing, but there was no sign of any movement in the body, just the arm, held out like a silent, ominous gesture. My breath caught in my throat. What the hell is that? The driver slammed his foot on the brake. The car lurched to a stop, the tires screeching against the gravel, but when I looked again, the figure was gone. Gone? Just like that. The trees stood tall and silent, casting long shadows over the road, and there was nothing. Nothing at all. Drive. Drive now, I ordered, my voice barely a whisper. The driver, though visibly shaken, didn't hesitate. He slammed his foot back on the accelerator, and we sped forward, faster now, too fast. But it didn't feel like we were leaving anything behind. It felt like the road itself was closing in on us. I kept staring out the window, half expecting to see another figure, another shape, waiting for us in the darkness. But there was nothing. Only the same thick blackness, the same oppressive silence. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, watching us. The whole time, it felt like we weren't alone, as if the trees themselves were moving closer with every mile. The woods seemed to stretch on endlessly, and no matter how fast we went, the road wouldn't end. That's when we saw it, just up ahead, barely visible in the dark, the outline of a structure. It wasn't the farmhouse, though. This was something different. A shed. It stood alone by the side of the road, half buried under vines and overgrowth. The windows were black, empty holes in the side of the structure, and the door creaked open slightly, as if it had been waiting for us. We had to stop. Something about it felt wrong. The car came to a halt. Should we go in? Someone asked. I didn't want to, but the curiosity, that unnatural need to know what was happening, pushed me forward. Let's check it out, I said, almost against my better judgment. We all stepped out of the car, the air immediately colder than before, the night darker. And as we approached the shed, that's when we heard a sound, a scraping, dragging sound coming from inside. We stood there for a moment, the cold air biting at our skin, as the scraping noise continued from inside the shed. The sound was rhythmic now, deliberate, like something or someone was dragging something heavy across the floor. It was a sickening noise, one that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Every instinct inside me screamed to turn and run, to get back in the car and drive as far away from this place as possible. But instead, I found myself moving closer, one step at a time, as if some unseen force was pulling me toward it. The others were silent, all of us caught in the same dreadful trance. No one spoke, and I could see the fear in their eyes. It wasn't just the uncertainty of what lay ahead. It was the realization that something was very wrong here, something we couldn't explain, something we didn't want to understand. We were standing in front of the shed now, the door creaking in the breeze, barely hanging on its hinges. The scraping sound grew louder, more frantic, and I could feel my heart racing in my chest. I should have said something. I should have told everyone to leave, to get back to the car. But I couldn't speak. My mouth was dry, my throat tight. I reached for the door handle. Don't, one of the others whispered urgently. We don't know what's in there, but it was too late. The door swung open with a loud groan, and we all stepped back, instinctively holding our breath as we peered inside. The interior was dimly lit, the only source of light coming from a single, flickering bulb that hung from the ceiling. The floor was covered in layers of dirt and old debris, but the most disturbing thing was the object in the center of the room. It was large, covered in a thick tarp, its shape indistinguishable. The scraping noise had stopped, replaced by a low, guttural sound, almost like a low hum, coming from the tarp itself. I didn't know what I was expecting, but it wasn't this. The hum grew louder as we stood there, frozen in place. Something was definitely inside that tarp, and whatever it was alive. The air around us felt charged, as if the very atmosphere had shifted. The temperature had dropped, the air growing colder with each passing second. I felt the chill in my bones, a deep, unnatural cold that seemed to seep into my skin, into my very soul. Without warning, the tarp shifted. It wasn't just the wind, it moved, as if something underneath it had stirred. The hairs on my arms stood up, and my pulse quickened. The others were just as still as I was, all of us watching in horror as the shape underneath the tarp began to shift again. Then, it happened. The tarp was thrown aside with a violent jerk, revealing what lay beneath. I can't even begin to describe what I saw. It was like something out of a nightmare, too grotesque, too horrifying to be real. A man, or what had once been a man, lay there, his body twisted and deformed in ways that defied logic. His skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over his bones. His eyes were wide, bulging out of their sockets, and his mouth was open in a silent scream. His fingers were long, unnaturally elongated, like claws, and his body twitched sporadically as if it were struggling to move, but it couldn't. He wasn't dead. At least, not in the way we understood death. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't human anymore. It was something else, something twisted and wrong, something that should never have existed. I stumbled backward, my mind scrambling to comprehend what I was seeing. My legs felt weak, and I nearly fell to the ground, but somehow I managed to stay on my feet. The others were just as shaken, their faces pale with fear, their bodies rigid with terror. "What the hell is that?" One of them managed to whisper, his voice trembling. I didn't have an answer. I didn't even know what to think. All I knew was that whatever it was not something we were meant to seek, let alone encounter. And yet, there it was, lying in front of us, its eyes fixed on us, unblinking. Suddenly, the creature's head jerked upward, its eyes locking onto mine. It wasn't just a gaze, it was a stare, a deep, unsettling stare that seemed to pierce through me, through my very soul. I felt like I was drowning in its gaze, like it was pulling me into some kind of abyss I couldn't escape from. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to get away from this thing, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, caught in its gaze like a moth to a flame. It didn't blink, it just stared, and the air around us grew colder, heavier, until I felt like I was suffocating. Then I heard it. A voice, low and raspy, a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't a voice that came from the creature's mouth, but from deep within the room, within the very walls of the shed. The sound was distant, hollow, and yet it was unmistakable. "Help me." The words echoed in my mind, and I could feel them vibrating through my bones, a deep, resonating sound that seemed to fill every corner of my being. The others were frozen too, their eyes wide with terror as they stared at the creature, unable to look away. It was like the room had ceased to exist, like we were trapped in a void, with nothing but this thing and its gaze. Then, without warning, the creature moved. It was slow, deliberate, but it was enough to break the trance. I gasped, stumbling backward, my feet slipping on the dirt floor as I tried to get away. It reached out with one of its long, claw-like hands, and I saw its fingers curl and uncurl, the tips of its claws scraping against the floor with a sound that made my stomach turn. "Run!" I shouted, my voice hoarse, panicked. "Get out of here!" We all turned, bolting for the door, our hearts pounding in our chests. But as we reached the entrance, I turned for one last look, and that's when I saw it. The creature was standing now, its twisted form upright, its gaze still fixed on me. It was moving toward us slowly, but it was moving. I didn't wait. I ran, my legs pumping as fast as they could go, my breath coming in short gasps. We all ran, blindly, desperately, as if the very act of running could save us from what was behind us. But the darkness seemed to close in around us, suffocating us, pressing us toward the road. I didn't dare look back, not even once. We had to get to the car. We had to leave this place. I could still feel its eyes on me, though, still hear that low whisper in my mind, the words, "Help me," repeating over and over like a haunting mantra. We reached the car, our hands trembling as we fumbled for the keys. The engine roared to life, and without a second thought, we sped off into the night, the headlights barely cutting through the darkness ahead. But as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't escaped. We hadn't escaped at all. We drove in silence, the only sound the hum of the engine and the tires crunching against the gravel road beneath us. The events inside the shed were still fresh in my mind, too vivid to ignore, too horrifying to forget. I couldn't stop seeing the creature's eyes, its grotesque, twisted form that still haunted the corners of my vision. Even though we were speeding away from that cursed place, it felt like we hadn't truly left it behind. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. The others were just as tense, their eyes wide, still haunted by what we'd seen. No one dared to speak. What could we say? There was nothing to explain it, no words that could make sense of what we had just witnessed. The road ahead was pitch black, the headlights the only source of light in the oppressive darkness. I glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following us, something that shouldn't be there. But all I saw was the empty stretch of road behind us, the trees lining either side, their shadows stretching out like long fingers reaching for us. We were safe, for now, but I didn't feel safe. I felt a coldness creeping through my veins, a dread that seemed to settle deep in my chest. It was like the creature's presence had followed us, its eyes still watching from the shadows, its voice still echoing in my mind. I had to shake myself out of it. We were driving away from it, and that was all that mattered. We had to get out of here, get back to some semblance of normalcy. But when I glanced at the others, I could see it in their faces. They didn't feel normal either. We were all changed by what had happened, and none of us knew how to process it. I could tell that the questions were building up in their minds, the same ones that were plaguing me. What was that thing? How had it come to be? And why had it been trapped in that shed, dragging itself across the floor, whispering for help? I broke the silence. "We need to go to the authorities," I said, my voice steady, though I didn't feel steady at all. "Someone needs to know what's happening out there. Someone needs to look into that shed, that thing, whatever it was." They all turned to look at me, their expressions a mix of disbelief and fear. No one spoke for a moment, and I could feel the tension building again. Finally, one of them, the one who had been the most vocal back at the shed, spoke up. "You really think anyone's going to believe us?" His voice was rough, like he hadn't used it in days. "We just saw. God, what we saw. Who's going to believe that? They'll think we're crazy. They'd think we were crazy if I didn't see it with my own eyes." He was right. How could anyone believe something like that? How could anyone understand what we had experienced without seeing it for themselves? I could already picture the authorities dismissing our claims, calling it some kind of collective hallucination or wild imagination. But it wasn't a hallucination. It was real. We had all seen it. "So, what do we do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "We keep driving," another voice answered. "We just keep going. There's nothing we can do now. That thing, whatever it was, it's not our problem anymore. We made it out. We need to leave it behind." I wanted to argue, to say that we couldn't just ignore what had happened, that we had to tell someone. but something deep inside me told me he was right. We had to leave it behind. If we didn't, it would follow us forever, haunting us like a shadow that never left. The car seemed to eat up the miles as we drove, the headlights cutting through the darkness, but it didn't feel like we were going anywhere. The weight of what we had witnessed pressed down on us, suffocating, and there was no escaping it. After what felt like hours, we finally reached the town. The familiar lights of the streets, the hum of traffic, the bustling noise of a place that seemed so normal compared to the nightmare we had just survived. But it all felt so empty, like it was just a facade, a mask hiding the truth of what lay beyond it. I pulled into a parking lot, my eyes scanning the familiar surroundings. But nothing felt familiar anymore. I felt like a stranger in my own life, like the world had shifted in some subtle, irreversible way. I wanted to believe that everything would go back to normal, that we could just forget what happened and move on with our lives. But I knew better. That thing was still out there. I didn't know where, but I knew it hadn't been left behind. And I knew that it would never let us go. The others got out of the car, their movements stiff, reluctant, as though they too were struggling to shake off the fear that clung to them. We didn't speak as we walked to the entrance of the building we had parked in front of, the weight of what we had experienced hanging heavily between us. "Are we okay?" one of them finally asked, breaking the silence. I mean, are we okay? I didn't know how to answer. What did that even mean? Were we okay? Physically, yes. We were alive. We had escaped. But mentally, emotionally, no, we weren't okay. I don't think any of us would ever be okay after what we saw. We walked into the building, the air inside thick with tension, and as we settled into our seats, I felt that cold presence once again, like something was watching us from the shadows. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was there, just beyond the walls, lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike. The rest of the night passed in a blur of half-hearted attempts at conversation, but none of us could shake off the feeling of unease. Every creak of the building, every rustle of paper, seemed amplified, like a warning. And no matter how many lights we turned on, no matter how many doors we locked, we couldn't outrun the feeling that we weren't truly safe. I don't know what happened to the others. We all went our separate ways after that night. Some of us tried to forget, to go back to normal lives, but I can tell you this, none of us ever truly did. We all had questions that no one could answer, and we all lived with the knowledge that we had seen something that shouldn't exist, something that should never have been allowed to walk this earth. The darkness followed us all, and no matter how hard we tried to move forward, we knew we were never really free. It wasn't over. It would never be over. Not for us. The years have passed since that night, and life, in many ways, has tried to move on. But I can't shake the feeling that something is still there, lurking just beneath the surface. There's a lingering weight, a pressure in my chest, as if the memory of that night is pressing against me, threatening to break through again. It's not something I speak about much. How do you talk about a terror that defies explanation? How do you explain something that wasn't just a nightmare, but a tangible, flesh and bone presence? A reality that twisted everything we knew into something far darker. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I lie awake and wonder if it was all a bad dream. Maybe we all hallucinated it, our minds warping reality into something more terrifying. But deep down, I know it wasn't. I can still feel the chill in the air, the oppressive silence before the creature's appearance, the smell of damp earth and rotting wood that filled that cursed shed. It was real. It was real. And that feeling, that lingering dread, has never left me. It's there in the quiet moments, in the hours when I'm alone with my thoughts. It's in the dark corners of rooms, in the places I don't dare to look when I'm walking at night. It's in the way the shadows seem to stretch a little too far, just beyond the edge of my vision. Always waiting. I can't go back to that place. I know that now. No matter how much I might want to confront what happened, to get answers, to understand what we saw, The truth is that some things aren't meant to be understood. Some things should remain buried. And maybe the real horror is realizing that there are some questions that have no answers. That there are forces in this world far beyond our comprehension. Things that exist in the spaces between light and dark, between life and death. The others? I haven't seen them in years. After that night, we all went our separate ways. We couldn't speak about it. We couldn't share what we had witnessed without being consumed by it. So we drifted apart, as people often do after shared trauma. It's strange how easily we can become strangers again, how the connection we once had can unravel in the face of something that we can't fully explain. I tried to move on. I got a job, met new people, and rebuilt my life. I've even settled in a new town, far away from where that shed still stands, untouched and forgotten by most. But every now and then, when the wind is just right, or when the sun sinks too quickly behind the horizon, I can feel it. That cold presence. That waiting. Something. The world keeps turning, and I keep moving forward, but the memories of that night, of what we saw, never quite fade. And there are times, too many times, when I catch myself looking over my shoulder, wondering if it's all over or if it's just waiting for the right moment to come back. Maybe it's my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe the mind does that to protect itself from what it can't process. But when I close my eyes and let myself remember, I hear that raspy voice, that whisper that was never meant for our ears. It calls to me, even now, and I can't help but feel the chill of those words crawl down my spine. I've learned to live with it, to live with the questions that will never have answers. But there are nights when I wonder, what if the others still feel it too? What if they too lie awake at night, haunted by that same creature, that same presence? And I can't help but wonder if they think, like I do, that it's still out there, that it never truly left. And maybe that's the worst part of it all, the knowing that you can never really escape something like that. Not fully. Because when it's part of you, when it burrows so deep inside you that you can't separate it from who you are, how can you ever truly walk away?